Good afternoon. On behalf of the Faith and Science Sabbath School, I want to welcome you to this meeting. Um, Dr. Robert Gentry is here today, and I'm going to turn over most of the time to him. But briefly, by way of introduction, Robert Gentry is got his master's in physics from the University of Florida.
Correct.
He's worked in the defense industry, Martin Marietta, and General Dynamics,
Correct.
and then did quite a bit of research in radio halos at Oak Ridge Laboratories in Tennessee,
Right.
and then testified in the Arkansas creation trial on behalf of the defendants. And after that, his work became a bit more difficult. But I'm sure you'll get to hear more about that from him. In the meantime, he has branched out from radio halos and has done some work on cosmology, and you'll get to hear about both of those subjects today. This morning, we're very pleased to have you here, Robert Gentry, and thank you so much for coming. As we begin, shall we bow our heads for prayer? Our kind Heavenly Father, we thank you for the privilege of looking at your creation and trying to make sense out of it and trying to understand how it meshes with your word. And we ask that you will bless as we listen today, help us to understand, and help us to draw closer to you because of what we see and hear and think today. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. It's only fair that I give you a little background information as to where I came from. I grew up in a Christian home, went to the University of Florida, and after a period of time listening to the biology teachers telling me about evolution, I wasn't impressed very much at all. But when I started taking my physics courses, I was introduced to the grand topic of radioactivity. And as any physicist knows, if you go into the laboratory today and you measure the decay rate of a particular radioisotope, everything is okay, stable. Well, I was told at that particular time, that's part of being a physicist. You accept that uniform decay proposition forever and ever and ever. So I did. And as I graduated there from the University of Florida, before I graduated, I took a course in cosmology in the master's degree program and was thoroughly convinced of Big Bang cosmology, ancient age of the Earth, ancient age of life. So when I graduated with a master's degree and went out to the defense industry at that time, Fort Worth, Texas, General Dynamics, and did my very best to convince my fellow workers of Big Bang cosmology. Now, I didn't give up belief in God, but I assimilated, I thought, what was the grand truth of ancient cosmos, 1 billion year, 2 billion year days of whatever, with the Genesis account. So I was telling all my friends, you got to get on the ball if you want to listen to anything in the science. You got to get into the Big Bang situation. And then my wife and I moved from Fort Worth back to Orlando, Florida, and an atheist friend of mine there, one morning, at Convent of Marietta at that particular time, he said there was somebody, I needed to watch on television. So next week, my wife and I listened to this man, and he started talking about the Bible differently than I had heard before. But I was curious, so I started listening, kept on listening, and eventually it came to the place where this man, this evangelist, was talking about the fourth commandment. 4 and 6 days, the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, mountains and waters, and all that in them is. Now I thought, wait a minute, this is not really what I believe is true. In fact, I said, I don't believe it. at all. In any event, went back and forth with this situation for quite a while. And I eventually joined the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which at that time I understood accepted the fourth commandment and Genesis, and then there's some passages in the book of Revelation as definitive, being true. But in my mind, I was in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, but I wasn't fully convinced of everything that related to creation. Now, I didn't want that to be with me all my life. So anyway, I left the defense industry, went to the University of Florida, and worked in the math department there for a while, and then went up to a little college in Washington State, Walla Walla College. And I was trying to get a handle on this issue of the age of the earth. And I was told by the professors, physics professors among others, that indeed within the Adventist Church, that problem had already been resolved. That, what I needed to do as a new member of the church was to simply accept the idea that indeed the earth is very, very old, but that life is very, very young. And I said to myself, folks, I don't know where you come from, but that's not the science that I learned. There is no separation. And that whatever's going on, with you and others in the church, I said, I don't buy it. It's not true. But anyway, they told me, if you really want to make a contribution to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, I was teaching up at Walla Walla, needed to get a PhD. So I arranged, in God's providence, to go down and start teaching at Georgia Tech in Atlanta to then get a PhD. Well, one of the first things I did on arriving at Georgia Tech was to go see the chairman of the physics department. And I was very upfront with him. He was a very nice gentleman. He was Baptist, Presbyterian, I'm not sure now what he was, but he was a Christian. Anyway, we became very well acquainted because as I approached him, I said, here's the situation. I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. And the Seventh-day Adventists believe, and I pointed out to him the fourth commandment. And I said, that fourth commandment to me says, we got 6 days, literal days of creation. Here I am, as a person who's learned evolution, Big Bang, and on and on and on, seven cosmic periods of time. I said, I don't want to live my life with a state of uncertainty. So what I want to do, I'm just being upfront with you right off the bat. I want to do the thesis topic here at Georgia Tech in physics on the age of the earth. He looked at me and he said, you're kidding. I said, no. He said, here's the situation. By this time, he was calling me Bob. He says, here's the situation, Bob. You well know that the physics community in the world, you know this, holds the Big Bang in great respect. Hundreds of thousands of physicists have gone through this business of investigating the age of the earth. He said, I did that. And so I can sort of empathize with what you're going through. But he said, Bob, you just got to get into the program. You've only got a master's degree. Who do you think you are? You're going to go back and study this topic of the age of the earth? You're going to find something that nobody else has found? And, it was a little back and forth, but it was always very, very friendly. But I would keep coming back. We'd go out and eat at the cafeteria at Georgia Tech at lunchtime. Inevitably, this would be the topic of the conversation. And I kept pressing the issue, I got to do this for my thesis. And he was saying, no, you can't. Here's it. Then he came back and he said one day, he said, Bob, here's the situation. I don't think you had a chance in this world. I think your chances of finding something if you were to do this thesis are microscopic. But he said, even though I believe that your chances of finding something are microscopic if I let you do this thesis, nevertheless, there might be something tiny, super microscopic, something that's almost insignificant in terms of evolution. And you might want to say, well, here's something that might raise a little tiny bit of question about some tiny obscure point of evolution. And because you're here on the faculty of Georgia Tech, I was full-time instructor and also taking graduate courses. That means you would want to go ahead and do what? You want to publish that little tiny insignificant bit of information about evolution. He said, I couldn't let you do that. He said, here's the problem. If you were to do that, here at Georgia Tech, one of the preeminent scientific institutions in America, especially here in the South, there are people here who are inevitably, completely convinced that evolution is true. And so as a result of that, they would, if they saw that indeed you published something like this or heard about it, there would be chaos and pandemonium here at Georgia Tech. I just couldn't stand, Bob, I can't take that chance. So inevitably he said to me, look, you got to make a decision. Either you got to make a decision to go wherever you want to go and do whatever you want to do in this age of the earth business, or. So I said, okay, those are the conditions. And I said, you know, one thing I think you need to understand. What you're telling me, Chairman of the Department, Joe Howie, what you're telling me is, you know, that I need to accept what you and others have found, what you have discovered. I said, I'm not interested in learning what other people have done. I'm interested in finding the truth for myself. What you're telling me is, I need a mentor. If you go through the PhD program, you're going to be mentored so you'll learn the truth about the age of the earth if you're uncertain about it right now. You're going to need a mentor. That's what you need, Bob, a mentor. And I said, you know, I happen to believe in the God of heaven. I happen to believe in the answer to prayer. And I begun to pray the God of heaven would help me to understand whether evolution is really true, or if it's not true, what else is? You know, there's the fourth commandment, there's creation. I didn't know anything about it. So in the event, I left. I didn't have any money, borrowed money. My wife we had 2 children, another one on the way. She could have left me, not really, because she loves me, and still does after many, many years. In any event, I found out after I did this that the main issue about radioactivity and dating and the age of the earth and the cosmos and everything else is this whole idea of constancy of radioactive decay, plus constancy of, you know, the things concerning the Big Bang. Well, I found out that indeed there are these little tiny circles in granite rocks. And physicists have used these little tiny circles produced by the decay of uranium and thorium in these rocks. And they have ascertained, they think, evidence that the decay rate has always been constant. So I said to myself, if that's where the evidence supposedly lies, that's where I'm going to begin my investigations. And I did. Borrowed money to go up to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and get samples of granite where they had been investigated way back in the 1930s by a series of investigators, G.H. Henderson and others, 4 papers in the Royal Society, proceedings of the Royal Society. Anyway, I went up there, and for a couple of days they couldn't find anything as far as the ancient collections, old collections were concerned. But before I left, they found those collections, some of them, and I looked at them under the microscope while I was there, and then I had to leave. My money was running out. And so I asked them if they would let me take those little boxes back to Decatur, Georgia, and they did. There weren't very many there. And what I saw, you know, was marginally useful. What I needed to do was to get the actual samples of granite, micas, biotypes. This is where it was all found at that particular time, and begin to see if I could look in the microscope and find out for myself whether there had been any variation in the ring structure of these halos, as they were called. So that's what I began to do. A friend of mine, a minister friend, borrowed a microscope for me, and I started using a microscope. I got these samples that I brought back from Dalhousie, and day after day I was there looking in the microscope, and it's a very, very, very tedious, time-consuming task to look under the microscope day after day, hour after hour, to see what you can find under the microscope that might be useful for this topic of whether indeed the decay rate has always been constant. Well, my funds, such as they were, ran out. And so for a while then, I taught at Sandy Springs High School in Atlanta. Then I got such strong impressions that I could not do anything else but investigate this topic of the age of the earth. But I stopped that. Went up to New York City at the American Physical Society meeting, and at that particular time presented a paper, a very, very small, short paper. You know, I'm looking at it, trying to discern what's going on, not anything of any great significance, any significance hardly at all. But in any event, as I kept on looking under the microscope, we're going to get to what we're going to be accomplishing here in just a minute, I saw something which I had not expected to see. Other people had seen them, and that's where we're going to begin. Except now, right now, I'm going to start with what I did just a few weeks ago at the American Physical Society meeting, presenting a paper there at the American Physical Society meeting in Atlanta. There you can see, that's the first slide of my presentation there in Atlanta. Actually, I had a poster presentation at 4x8, and that's where it all started. Well, let's go then to the next slide. Here's the way I have come to view the situation. I didn't view it this way to begin with, but this is the way I've come to view it. That really the situation between the Bible, the fourth commandment, creation, and evolution is very, very simply defined. Either the foundational assumptions of the Big Bang and evolutionary geology are all right, if those foundational assumptions are correct, then evolution is true. But on the other hand, if there is indeed scientific evidence that the fourth commandment, God creating the universe, if there's scientific evidence there for that foundational postulate, regardless of what you may or may not have heard, the Seventh-day Adventist Church has a fundamental postulate, foundational postulate. And that foundational postulate is that the fourth commandment, the one that was written on tables of stone by Jesus Christ and given to Moses, that foundational postulate is not only just roughly true, it is exactly true. And so it's very simple. With the Big Bang, you've got these foundational assumptions of the origin of matter. Where did the matter actually come from? We're going to be talking about that. Space-time expansion, that deals with the Big Bang. Conservation of energy. Most people don't even know that indeed the Big Bang theory involves humongous non-conservation of energy. We'll get into that. And the other assumption is the universe is everywhere the same. We'll get into that. So as a result of that, basically we're saying the tested theories of science, mechanics, electromagnetism, optics, light, nuclear physics, thermodynamics have all had their central assumptions validated experimentally in the laboratory thousands of times. So our discussion this afternoon does not relate at all to the actual physical mechanics, optics, nuclear physics, and so forth. All these topics that we learn in physics, their foundations have all been validated in the laboratory many, many, many times. But what we're talking about this afternoon is the extension of those theories, meaning that it's an add-on. Meaning that, indeed, these theories, as you go through the curriculum, as I did, emerge so very, very, very carefully as I listened to the courses and so forth. The professors merged from the actual discussion of the actual mechanics, optics, nuclear physics, and so forth, to the past. Now, if you start to deal with the past, you've got to interpret the data of something. That interpretation requires foundational assumptions. And what we're going to tell you this afternoon is that those foundational assumptions that were introduced into evolution are as wrong as they can be. We're going to show that this afternoon. False scientific theories now are built upon central assumptions which have never been validated. Most of you in this room, with the exception of perhaps of one person, don't know that those other assumptions are as false as they can possibly be. Anyway, they can masquerade, what we're saying is that they can masquerade these theories, evolution, Big Bang, and so forth, can masquerade for decades and even centuries before their falsity is actually discovered. As I looked under the microscope, this is a picture of a little tiny, what we call a radioactive halo, taken under a microscope, little tiny spot there in the center, radiated particles out from the center. It was in a piece of mica, a piece of biotite, common mineral in granite, and as it did that, basically it created a sphere of coloration. Well, now what I did was to slice the granite very thinly and put it under the microscope, and this is what I saw many, 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 many times. Here's another set, except now it's got the inner circle and now the outer ring. And then I've got a schematic here, another one that you see in the micas. It's got three shells. This is what it looks like in 3 dimensions. You got a center, and you've got these 3 shells, those shells, and we won't get into all the technical details here, particles in that little tiny center shot out. They're alpha particles, the helium nuclei, over a period of time, and they discolored then the mineral around that little tiny center. Now it's a cross section, and we say, of a polonium-218 halo. And you notice down there it says the polonium-218 half-life is only 3 minutes. That's what makes all this so fascinating. Here's one of the actual polonium-218 halos, as you see it under the microscope. And here is a whole batch of them. Well, you may not be impressed this afternoon as you look at this, but I can tell you this. There are eminent Nobel laureate physicists whom I have spoken to, and I'll try to remember to give you the details later, who in seeing this particular set of polonium-218 halos, one of them said, "Miracle, miracle." Then he caught himself. Why would he do that? Why would another one say, you know, this is enough to make a believer out of you? Why would they say that? That's what we're going to be talking about this afternoon. Basically, see, these are taken through a microscope. I cleave the mic and put it on the microscope. There they are. But why did those people react the way they did? Now, they knew exactly what was going on once they saw the picture because they're eminent nuclear physicists. Now, this afternoon, as you see them, you know, you're going to have to have some background before you get any further and understand what's going on here. That's what we intend to do. Basically, it's very, very simple. If you look at this schematic, if you drop an Alka-Seltzer into a glass of water, after 1 minute, the physis is gone, and after 100 years, you still don't see any bubbles. But if indeed you were to instantly freeze the glass of water, then indeed, after 1 minute, those bubbles would be there. After 100 years, it would still be there. That's the idea. You see, this Earth supposedly, according to the Big Bang Theory, this Earth, all of you today, all of myself and everyone here, we're all basically residues. We're stardust. From the Big Bang, we'll get into that a little bit more, but supposedly we're all stardust, and that the Earth itself cooled. It was a huge ball of magma cooling over billions of years, and indeed, finally, the granite rocks formed. But what we're saying here is you can't have something cooling down over billions of years, which is something embedded in there as a magma that only lasts for a few minutes. Something is wrong. Well, that's what I'll just go through very, very quickly and give you some idea of what it actually appears to be. If you're watching, if you could see the halo develop, there's a little spot in the center, and those particles shoot out. Then they shoot out more and more rings begin to develop because it's what is called a genetic sequence of radioactive decay. Anyway, we get to the point where more and more particles and more of the rings become visible. And at last we have then the center, and then we have these rings from the 3 isotopes of polonium, 210, 214, 218. It's not imperative that you know the names and so forth. What is imperative for us to discuss this afternoon is the fact that this polonium has only a 3-minute half-life. That's number one. Then we'll tell you something else about what's important. I was at my microscope in Decatur, Georgia, after leaving Georgia Tech and leaving Sandy Springs and so forth. And I was looking into the microscope one day, and we just got through looking, a minute ago, about these halos, okay? And I was puzzling as I looked at them. I thought to myself, how in the world can it possibly be that the Earth can cool down over billions of years of time, and yet these halos could be embedded just like the Alka-Seltzer? Something has got to be wrong. You cannot have bubbles in frozen water, so to speak, if indeed the water is going to be boiling hot, for hundreds of years. So anyway, I was looking into the microscope at something like this and thinking to myself, my evolutionary theory training tells me this can't be true because the granite magma melt was cooling down over such a long period of time. It's impossible for these halos to ever develop. But as I was thinking about it, 2 verses in the Bible came to my mind, sort of flashed into my mind. Now, I've never heard God speak to me. I've never heard an angel speak to me. But those verses flashed in my mind that particular afternoon. By the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. For he spake, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood fast. I was awed. Immediately, it occurred to me the great Creator God of the universe had placed his signature of creation in the foundation rocks of the earth. The granite rocks are the basement rocks of the earth. Hebrews 1:10 says, in the beginning, Lord, you laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. He actually identifies the rocks that he created. In the beginning, Lord, you laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands, right next to it, sequence-wise. So I was excited. Obviously, I'd been looking and spent anything and everything to try to find out the truth. And here it was, I thought, revealed to me that day, and those verses in the Bible flashing in my mind. Well, I had these two friends. Well, one friend there in Decatur who had helped find me a borrowed microscope, and I went to see him that night. He's a minister. He knew I'd been working and finding nothing. I went to see him that night, and I was excited. And I told him what had happened. But these verses flashed in my mind. I said, that's the answer to what I can never understand. And that the people who have seen these before, they said what? They said that this radioactivity, instead of being initial there, had come from some other source, some distant source from uranium. And I explained that to him briefly. And his reaction was, instead of being very, very enthused, his reaction was, Bob, you better be careful. You may have made a mistake. Well, the next night I went down to some other friends in Columbus, Georgia, who had supported me. And I told them the same thing. They were both physicians. And I thought, well, surely with a little more academic training, they'll be understanding. They'll understand what's going on. They said the same thing. And so it occurred to me, no one is ever going to believe me unless I get to a place where I can begin to publish the results of experiments. I understood that indeed something flashing into your mind is not proof, okay? But I also understood that in trying to communicate what I thought was now the truth, I had to do a whole lot of experimental work. I had to do it in a format, in a place, that had credibility. I didn't have any credibility scientifically. So in any event, I began to pray. My wife and I began to pray. And actually, while I was there in Decatur, I was able to publish a paper on this particular topic. Very, very simple paper. And first paper I sent in for publication, I said, here's this evidence. It's evidence for fiat creation. And it was sent out for review. And the reviewer sent back and said, this man, he needs to go back and redo his experimental work and think about it and so forth. Then, maybe he can send it into a journal such as Nature. Some of you may know Nature is, along with Science, the two most widely read scientific journals in the world. In any event, things worked out for me to be able to go up to Columbia Union College in Tacoma Park, Maryland, began to do my research there. And the whole idea was to publish something that would catch the attention of the evolutionists. You see, because it's no great big deal for me to come and speak to a group of Seventh-day Adventists who already believe in creation. Now, I understand there's an issue out here, and there's a local university that has come to the news, and some of the people there apparently are saying they don't believe in creation in some ways. But in any event, I wasn't interested in coming to the Sunday schools, Sabbath schools, and so forth. I was interested in finding out for myself the truth. And I knew there's only one way to do that, and that's to find a place where I can do research, publish papers, present it to the world. Why do that? Because the evolutionists had the most to lose if what I was saying was true. They got everything to lose. That means the God of heaven has stepped in and has done things which they could never do. And indeed, if I was wrong, and some of my experimental work was wrong, then indeed they would jump all over it, and there'd be hundreds of papers published to show indeed that I was wrong. So anyway, I went up to Columbia Union College, and I thought, I better check to see if I can find somebody that would give me a little insight as to what they thought would be the best way to go. While I was at Walla Walla, Dr. Wallace Brody was then the Foreign Secretary of the American Chemical Society. He was in Washington. So I went to see him. And I told him what I was doing and what I'd found. Surprisingly, he said the following. He said, you know, as a young man, I was over in Germany, the halite mines. He said, there in the halite mines, you can actually see these crystals, large crystals. It's as if someone had had a jar or bowl, a very heavy liquid, and they had poured in a vial of India ink, black ink. But instead of spreading all over the place, it's like it was frozen in situ. So he had this black, like it was a spreading liquid inside this clear liquid. In other words, he was telling me that he had seen something, although he didn't come right out and say that he had the same idea that I did. He's saying, what you got to do is go and publish a paper in Science. It's the most widely read scientific journal in the world. If you're able to do that and get across the ideas that you presented to me, you're at least going to have a first start on finding the answer that you want to find. So I did. I began doing experiments there at Columbia Union College. I won't try to go into all the details of it today, except to say that surprises were in store as I continued. Let's go on back now. And this first paper, I'm getting ahead of myself just a little bit. I want to tell you what happened in the publication of this very first paper in Science. You can tell it was published way back in 1968. But it's the back of the scenes information that is so startling. First of all, I was doing analyses of these halos. And I won't try to go into all the technical details, but there is a way you can tell whether the radioactivity in the tiny centers actually was there initially when the rock itself formed, or whether it came in later. You see, if it came in later, then there's really no problem. In other words, the granite could have formed and the radioactivity come in later, you know, so there's no issue at all. So the whole issue here is the kind of radioactivity that was in those centers at the time the rock formed. Well, I did a whole series of experiments, 6 to 8 months, and was able to actually identify for sure that indeed the radioactivity was there in the center when it formed. There's no secondary radioactivity. So I sent it in for publication to Science. And as is always the case, Science sends out in all its articles, to be refereed, sends it out to referees who are experts in the field. So one of the experts sent back a review saying, go ahead and accept the paper for publication. But the other reviewer said, no way. This man, I can tell what he's saying here is that this radioactivity in these little tiny halos, these polonium halos, there was no precursor. There was nothing before that. That means that indeed there had to be, those halos formed, you know, without anything before it. That means that 3-minute half-life has got tremendous significance. So he said, don't publish this paper. So the editor, one of the higher editors of Science was handling the paper. So he sent it back to me and said, we're not going to publish your paper. So I looked at the review of the paper and I said, you know, to myself, I easily found an error basically in what the second reviewer was saying. So I called up the Office of Science, spoke to the particular editor who had handled the paper, and I said, you know, I think I have some information that, you know, would have a bearing on your rejecting my paper. I said, I'd like to come down and talk to you. Well, he waited a minute, half a minute or whatever. He said, well, okay. So I go down to see him. He's sitting at his desk. I walk into his office on the second floor of the Science building. His first question to me is, are you a Seventh-day Adventist? Yes. How old do you think the Earth is? 6,000 years. He said, I happen to be an evolutionary geologist. In other words, you're coming in here telling me the Earth is only about 6,000 years old, and I'm an evolutionary geologist, been trained for, you know, who knows how long. I'm in this pristine editorial position, deciding what is going to be published and isn't going to be published. So articles that come in all over the world. You're going to come in here and tell me 6,000 years and so forth. I said, you know, the issue isn't it the issue here the evidence? Not what you have been taught. Not what you have been taught, not what you have been learned, but I'm bringing information that you haven't learned, that you haven't been taught, that you never thought of before as an indication that what you learned was wrong. And he could have thrown me out. But you know, he didn't. We sat and talked for about an hour. And as I explained more of the details, he said, all right, tell you what, I'll send this paper out for review again. This time he chose two of the world's eminent authorities, one in the field of radioactivity and the one in the field of cosmology. Now, why would he pick the radioactivity? We can understand. But why would he pick a referee world-renowned in the field of cosmology? Well, stop and think about it. Stop and think about it. Here's what one of the referees said, the one that was dealing with radioactivity. He wrote back now, this is now the second go-around, and this is the reviewer who is the world authority in the field of radioactivity. Listen to what he says. Gentry proposes in this and previous papers, I've only had one small paper in Nature, that extinct radioactivity is responsible for the halo's appearance of polonium, lead isotopes, and so on and so forth. And it is clear he means extinct natural radioactivity. Now, those are just three words we need to keep in mind. Very, very easy to understand. He means extinct natural radioactivity by his statements that the inclusions, the centers of the polonium halos, contain the specific alpha emitters responsible for the halos, or possibly in certain cases the beta-decaying lead precursors, at the time when the microcrystallized. In other words, my paper had made it absolutely clear that I had found evidence showing that indeed the polonium was there. Only the polonium was there. Nothing else. No precursor. And he said, that's what I understand Gentry is saying. In other words, he's now quoting me from the paper. I say, it is not clear how the existence of short half-life radioactivity may be reconciled with current cosmological theories, which envision long time spans between nucleosynthesis and the crustal formation. What does he mean by that? That's what we're going to say. Then he picks up and he says, does Gentry mean that current cosmological and geological theories are possibly so wrong that all the events leading from galactic or even protosolar nucleosynthesis to the formation of the crystal and rock minerals could have taken place in a few minutes? Now we need to focus on this because it's essential you understand this is what the referee said. And that's technical language, but we're going to break it down. It's very, very simple. Here is a schematic, a graphic. This is what Big Bang says, okay? Big Bang, 13, 14 billion years ago, supposedly. Where does it all come from? We'll find out that indeed no one knows. Talk about people who have to have faith in the Big Bang. Matter, energy springs out of nothing for no good reason. Anyway, the first things that form are just two elements, helium and hydrogen. That's helium, those are the stars. Those stars form, and after a long billions of years or whatever, you have supernova. Now, the supernova means that indeed, in their view, you start to get heavier elements. You don't know it, but today, every cosmologist in the world believes that they and you and the rest of us are part of supernova. You build heavy elements by neutron capture reactions over and over and over again. Blows out all of the universe, it recollects, does it again and again and again and again. Then you have the solar nebula, that's where we are. Then the Earth forms. But you see, the whole idea here of the supernova, the distance or the time between the supernova and the formation of the Earth, that's this extinct natural radioactivity. And indeed, it could be in the matter of, they think, millions or billions of years from the supernova formation of the heavier elements to the solar nebula to the time the Earth forms. Basically, he was saying, I understand what Gentry is saying. He's saying that indeed, supernova billions of years ago and the Earth forming, all that was collapsed to a time period of only 3 minutes. That's what he was saying in that review. And he asked, does Gentry really mean that? Guess what? He not only said it in his review, he actually put down to the editor the statement I want to talk to Gentry personally. I no sooner got that and read that statement that this man, world-renowned authority in radioactivity, said, I want to talk to this man personally, Gentry personally. I got on the phone with him. Guess what his first question was? What in the world are you saying? In other words, he wanted to hear it from my own lips. What in the world am I saying about this halos not having any precursors? That's got to mean that, you don't have anything from now back to the time of the origin of the elements. I said, God did it. You know what his next comment was? My grandfather was a Methodist minister. Then we started on the technical discussion of every aspect of the paper. Question after question after question for about an hour or more. And the more he asked, the friendlier he got, because I was able to respond in a friendly manner to every one of his questions. And after we went through that hour or so, I said, well, what now? He said, well, I have some questions I haven't been able to resolve. You've still got some work to do. He said, this is what you need to do. There are 2 or 3 other experiments that need to be done. I said, fine. He said, once you get those experiments done, you can write it all up again and send it into science, and they'll send it back to me. I'll take a look at it. We'll go from there. I said, fine. Well, this required me to go and get the services of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. This was before I was invited to be a guest scientist there. Anyway, I had a friend there, and things worked out. The God of heaven worked things out for me to go down to Oak Ridge for just several days. And then had to use a very high level of radioactivity and so forth. And it was done in a hot cell partially. Anyway, did all the experiments, came back and and wrote the paper up again. And it showed exactly what I had said to begin with, except now I had even greater evidence. And so I sent the paper into science, and I sent it back to him. And I called him after a few days, and I said, I've sent the paper back in, and where do we go from here? I said, I would like to come up and discuss this paper with you. He said, okay. Now, can you imagine? He said, I'll pick you up at the airport. I said, fine. On the way from the airport to his office, we started talking about, he said, what do you think about the fossils in the rocks? Some people say the devil put them there. Do you believe that? No. So we went off in a discussion of the flood instead of, evolutionary geology. Stayed there in his office the whole day. Went through the paper, not just sentence by sentence and so forth, word by word and sentence by sentence, and period by period and comma by comma, the whole day. He couldn't find anything to argue with. So he took me back to the airport that evening. Now, on the way back to the airport, he said, I understand what you say. You believe that God did this. Now, if you go back, and there were a few tiny changes he was suggesting, he said, if you go ahead and make these little changes we talked about today, nothing of any significance in terms of the arrows, send it back in and I'll decide. But he said, if you say in your revised article that God did this, no way. I'll never okay that paper for publication. I said, fair enough. So that's what I did. Went back and made the small corrections, and was going to be able to send it back in. In fact, I was headed toward that. Then I got a letter from any physicists here today, or others, will know the name of George Gamow as one of the preeminent founders of Big Bang cosmology. I got a letter from George Gamow, University of Colorado. He was inviting me to come out and give a colloquium at the University of Colorado in Boulder on a certain date there in the fall now of 1967. I was elated. George Gamow. And so I was planning to go. And I'm a vegetarian, so he invited me to stay at his home. So that's what caused me to alert him, that I'm a vegetarian and so forth. His wife got in touch with my wife and said, do I eat fish? In other words, they wanted to make sure that I was really going to get what I needed as far as food was concerned. Very, very cordial, friendly conversation with George Gamow prior to going out there. Well, the day came when I was, in fact, I went on the day prior to the actual colloquium. And when I got there, I called his home, and she said, oh, Mr. Gentry, so sorry to tell you, but my good husband is there in the hospital. He's had carotid artery surgery, but he said he wants you to come by the hospital. He has a lot of things to talk to you about these halos. I said, fine. So I went to the hospital that night and discussed with him, the paper. Now, I didn't know at that particular time what he knew. All I know is I was being asked to go out there and basically respond to the invitation, of course, for a colloquium. Anyway, we talked and talked and talked, and I was trying to communicate to him, there's something here that really is going to overthrow Big Bang big time. Because these halos show that indeed there was only a short minutes period of time between the actual formation of the chemical elements of the universe and the origin. You see, when this other referee said, does Gentry talk about, the cosmological significance, he understood that indeed, if you've got primordial radioactivity, extinct natural radioactivity, it's not isolated. That means you have defined, that discovery defines what happens throughout the cosmos. That means that indeed, you've got evidence here showing that indeed, it's not Big Bang this, long ages, evolution of the cosmos. The God of heaven actually put something in the foundation rocks of this earth that scientists understood to show that indeed the whole idea of long periods of time of cosmic evolution and so forth is dead wrong. It's all a part. When God created the heavens and the earth, it was that same creation week that he called into existence. The earth he called into existence, the heavens. We can talk a little bit more. Some people say, wait a minute, you can't do that. It takes billions of light years for the light to come from those places to the earth. You know what? Have they ever thought of the fact that indeed there's an assumption involved with respect to the speed of light? Oh, everybody believes that indeed the light speed from the distant reaches of the universe is only speed of light, 186,000 miles per second. That's true. A lot of people believe it. They want you to believe that it's gospel truth. But it isn't. It's an assumption, an unproven assumption. We will get a little bit more into that a little bit later on. What we're saying is there is this evidence within the foundation rocks of this earth that God placed here to show not only that this earth itself was the result of fiat creation, but the cosmos. In the beginning, the Lord laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of his hands. Anyway, this extinct natural radioactivity, the Big Bang situation, is that. But applying that same information then to the creation scenario simply means that indeed nucleogenesis, no longer nucleosynthesis, the synthesizing of the chemical elements in some distant event, but now nucleogenesis. Years ago, I spoke at Princeton University. Now, I had a talk similar to the one I'm giving right here, except I did not at that particular time say that God did everything. But I was bringing out the implications of these polonium halos. And here is a prominent member of the physics department at Princeton University. Comes up to me afterward and he said, listen, I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. He said, you're not saying that these polonium halos have anything to do with nucleosynthesis, the synthesizing of atoms that already existed. What you're saying is these polonium halos are evidence of nucleogenesis, creation. And there were other physicists standing nearby. And I said, that's it. So what I'm saying is I've gone places in high position, and people have seen this. Now, we'll talk a little more about it. Anyway, this is the whole idea. The creation halos of extinct natural radioactivity limit the time of the actual creation, whenever God spoke during that creation week. That's what happened. Let's continue. What did that do? Well, remember a minute ago I said that indeed that paper eventually got published, that went through those reviewers. Now I want to continue because there's something of, I believe, of great significance in the process. Remember that first reviewer, remember I took the paper and I sent it back into Science and he was going to take a look at it one last time and make a decision whether it should be accepted or not. By the way, what I just said implied that George Gamow approved the paper for publication. How do I know it was George Gamow? Because the editor confided in me when I told him I was going to be speaking at Boulder. He said, Bob, I don't know if I should tell you this or not, but George Gamow is the other referee of your paper. He approved it. Let's go back now to the first referee. The one I'd sent the paper back in, the one I'd visited, the one that said, you know, if you say God is there, then I'm not going to approve it. Anyway, that was about January now of February of 1968 when that paper went back in after I'd seen this person up at the university. I won't say which one right now. Anyway, and so I was waiting for the final declaration one way or the other. So week after week, because I didn't get any response, I would call this editor there at Science. By this time, it was Bob and we'll say his first name was Jim. Okay? Bob and Jim. We actually got together socially. He saw something going on in the reviews of this paper that he had never seen before. And he was willing, as the editor, one of the editors, to push it through to the ultimate to see whether indeed it was anyone was going to find an error before it was published. Anyway, January, February, March, I kept calling and I said, Jim, what's going on? Have you heard from the editor? Pardon me, have you heard from that referee? No, haven't heard anything, Bob. Haven't heard anything. I kept calling, and then there was the meeting of the American Geophysical Union in March now of 1968. I had a paper dealing with tektites. Tektites, very, very, very young age of the tektites instead of 37 million years. Turns out that this other person, this other referee, had a paper in that same issue of the proceedings of the AGU. Well, what I didn't want to happen, of course, was for me to go there and let him hear me say not only, we got evidence for creation, but to say basically very clearly, here's evidence for a young age of the earth as well. But nevertheless, that did happen. Now, he did not come. This referee did not come. He sent his co-worker because he got involved in one of the presidential elections at that particular time. Nevertheless, January, February, March, April, and so forth, I was still calling and saying, Jim, have you heard anything? No. One day I called Science and I said, I want to speak to Jim. And they said, Jim's not here. And I said, what's the matter? He said, he's in the hospital. He's had an operation. I said, oh no. I said, I've been waiting a long time to get news about this article. She said, well, what's the name of the article? And I said, so. There it is, fossil alpha recoil analysis of certain variant radioactive halos. And so she said, I'll see if I can find it. She looked, came back and said, I don't know any, well, I can't find it. We don't have any paper like that. I said, I assure you that you have that paper somewhere. She went back and looked again. I still can't find it. I said, I can assure you that paper is in for publication, and if you look again, you'll find it. She said, there's one place I didn't look. I'll go look. She came back and said, I found it. I said, where was it? She said, it's on the copy editor's desk. Copy editor's desk? I said, does that mean it's been accepted? Yes, it's going through to publication. I said, thank you. I hung up the telephone. Then after I got the proofs of the paper in the mail, turns out I thought there was a little change I needed to make. I made the change in the proofs. And because Jim had been so cordial and fair-minded in shepherding this thing through, not doing anything except what he was supposed to be doing, except now he wasn't going to take somebody else's mentoring of him for the truth. He wanted to see for himself the outcome of this. I called him up. He was back now from the hospital. Went down to see him. I said, Jim, I'd like to come down and talk to you and so forth. Went upstairs and we were sitting around his table and so forth. And then he said to me, Bob, whatever happened to that paper you had in for publication? I stood back and I said, Jim, you don't know? He said, no, what? I said, here it is right here. I've got the copy edited version right now to give to you for publication. It's ready to go. He almost, I think his face almost turned white. Maybe I'm mistaken. He said, Bob, okay, let me have the paper. He took the paper. Now, at that point in time, he saw, obviously, he went back and looked to see what the editors, the final referees said. It was public. It went forward to publication because it was approved by these world authorities. One cosmologist, one radiochemistry. Well, what did that do for us? Well, I was expecting perhaps an avalanche. Here I was telling the scientific world, science goes out to 50, 100,000 scientists around the world, that I was going to get some huge avalanche of criticism. Nothing happened. 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months. This was now, I think it came out about April 1968 or thereabouts, early May maybe. Nothing was happening. And I thought, whoa, what's going on? Is this because, that indeed they've looked at it, nobody can find any errors in it, and so forth? I don't know. But in the meantime, remember my initial desire was to get to a laboratory. Now, I was at Columbia Union College when I sent this in. I still wanted to go to a national laboratory some way, somehow, as a guest scientist, to be able to use the very best equipment, scientific equipment, do more and more and more experiments and publish in Science and Nature and whatever other journals are world-renowned, and get this out to even more. Repeat it. So I was there at my desk one day, and let me see if I can find it real quick like. I had found in the rocks that I was working with something called giant radioactive halos, something different than anything that had ever been seen or reported before. I had those in my laboratory. And I thought to myself, this has got to be of interest to the United States Atomic Energy Commission, because they had started a worldwide search for super heavy elements. Well, I wasn't a part of that at that particular time. So I thought to myself, though, I've got these giant halos that no one knows anything about, but I said maybe the Atomic Energy Commission might be interested. So I prayed one day and I said to myself, I'm just an ordinary citizen, but I've got that one published paper. So I called the office of Glenn T. Seaborg, chairman of the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, Nobel laureate from, of course, World War II days. And I asked the secretary if, a humble physicist at Columbia Union College come by and see Dr. Seaborg. And she said, sort of stuttered and said, well, I suppose so. Anyway, she said, he's out of the office right now, but he'll be back after a while. So after a while, I received a call from his associate, Justin Bloom. And Justin says, who are you? What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you calling for? And I said, Justin, here's the situation. I got these giant halos. I don't know what they are, but they may be relevant to the search, U.S. Atomic Energy Commission search for super heavy elements. But I said, more than that, Justin, I just had this other paper published in Science. You just had it published? I said, yes. He said, give me the reference. And I gave him the reference. He said, here I am in the library of the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, downtown Washington, D.C. I can go over there. We've got bound volumes of Science. Went over there to the stacks and pulled it out, opened it up, and he read the paper. He said, I think that Dr. Seaborg is going to be interested in talking with you. He said, here's the situation. Seaborg is going to be going to Berkeley here, Lawrence Radiation Laboratory, in just about an hour or two. He'll be leaving. And I don't think he's going to have time to see you today. I said, well, no big problem. I've got a Volkswagen. It will run down to Washington, D.C. in 20 minutes. I'll be there in no time at all. He said, okay. So I went down and I talked with Justin Bloom for a few minutes, showed him the pictures of the giant halos. He had already read the paper in Science. So when Glenn Seaborg came in the room, Justin Bloom was my promoter. He said, this man's found something. We need to get out to the national laboratories. when Seaborg went out to Berkeley that day, he talked to the people at the Large Radiation Lab, the eminent radiochemist, nuclear physicist he'd worked with all the time during World War II, and talked to them about what I'd done. He also talked to the people at Argonne National Laboratory, Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Anyway, the end result of it is that indeed Seaborg and the AEC wanted to know something about what the Soviets were doing. He said, I'll volunteer to write a letter in your behalf to the president of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. So you'll get in to the Soviet Academy of Sciences and the Soviet Nuclear Laboratory in Dubna at the height of the Cold War. And that's what happened. I was over there for about a month. Anyway, the bottom line is that I'm going out to the University of California at Berkeley. Remember earlier I told you I had some really super reactions to these polonium halos. I was giving a seminar out there when I first got there, and I pulled out this picture to a group of nuclear physicists now, a preeminent rank here in America, in the world. I showed that picture, and immediately, because they understood the significance and the implications of the short half-life and the origin of the Earth and so forth, one of them immediately said, this is enough to make a believer out of you. That night, I went to the HILAC, Heavy Ion Linear Accelerator, where the first right-hand man of Seaborg has worked for a long period of time. His name was Al Giorso. Al Giorso was there, and I went over to see him and met Nurmia, and he said, what are you here for? You know, he was sort of gruff. I said, well, I've just got this paper. It's been published. I got these giant halos. Thought, you know, Seaborg said I should come out and talk to you fellows. So he grabbed the paper and he said, let me have the paper. So I showed him the paper. He read it in about 5 minutes. He said, what are you getting at here? Something is not, you're not telling the whole story. And I sort of feigned him off, fitted him off, and I said, well, you know, I've still got many more experiments to do. I haven't told the whole story. Well, I can understand him. And he said, I want to know what's going on. He read the paper the second time. Asked me again, what's going on? You're hiding something. You're not telling the whole story. I said, well, that's true. There are some other things I know. He read it a third time. He came back and said, I want to know what is going on back of the scenes in this paper. I said, all right, you've asked me 3 times. I want to tell you, the God of heaven created the earth, and he left his fingerprints of creation, those polonium halos. Woo! He hit the ceiling. I argue with my wife all the time, he says. I grew up in a certain church, but I left it. I became an atheist. And you're coming in here and telling me you found this evidence for a creation, the God of heaven doing this? I don't believe it. Anyway, he really got upset with me. And then that brought our conversation for the evening to a close. I went back over to the men's dorm there at Berkeley and prayed and said, Lord, Al Giorso, the right-hand man of Glenn Seaborg, can submarine all my thoughts of ever getting into a national laboratory. All he's got to do is call Glenn Seaborg tomorrow and tell him, you know, this guy Gentry, he's way off the wall. He claims to have this information about creation. Now, Seaborg had read the paper himself, and he wasn't disturbed about it. But now, Al Giorso was presumably going to tell the truth, as I understood it. Anyway, went to sleep that night, came into the laboratory the next morning, and Matti Nurmia, the Finnish scientist, was there. He was very, very friendly. And the night before, he had told Al Giorso, give this man $1 million. He said, the research life of a scientist is very, very short. Pardon me. The life of a research scientist is very short, only a few years. Give this man some money. He's found something. He needs to follow up. Give him $1 million. Well, anyway, that was the night before. The next morning, Giorso comes into the laboratory. I'm already there. And I see him peer around the corner of the laboratory and look at me and turn around and go out again. Then I saw him do the same thing again. Come in and peer at me and turn around and leave. Third time, though, he didn't leave. Had a big cup of coffee in his hand. Came over to me face to face. He said, Bob, I want to tell you I stayed up half the night last night trying to think of another explanation. I couldn't find it. he became a good friend. He became a referee of papers that I sent into science, and he okayed every single one of them. Here's an atheist who was dealing with me differently as a result of seeing the evidence. Well, I've got to speed up or I won't finish. Any time is it? Who knows? In any event, we go from there to the fact that indeed Seaborg opened the door. I went to the Soviet Union. I don't have time to detail all the things that had happened in going to the Soviet Union, except it was a miracle of God's providence in several different ways. Number one, I'll mention to you very, very briefly. I was over in Europe in the Christmas time in 1967. I was over there to collect mineral samples. There's a famous mineralogist, Paul Ramdor, at the University of Heidelberg. Went to see him. I made prior arrangements. Said, I'm coming over. I wanted you to give me as many mineral samples as you can that basically you think may have halos in them, because I'm in the process of looking for all sorts of halos. Well, he did. He gave me all sorts of samples. But at the very end, we were sitting across from a round table from each other. And he reaches over, and he has a piece of mica in his hand, dark reddish mica of the order of something like this, actually about half the size of this cell phone. He reaches over and says, I want to give you this piece of mica, but it doesn't have any halos in it. And I think to myself, you're going to give me a piece of mica? And that's the reason I came all the way here to Heidelberg. He said, yes. Anyway, I graciously accepted that piece of mica. He wrapped it up in a piece of white, very stiff paper, handed it to me, and I said, thank you, thank you, thank you. Promptly went back to Columbia Union College and had a storage drawer full of mica specimens. I just threw it in there. And I threw away the ID slip to tell me where I got it, because he had told me there were no radioactive halos in that sample. I said to myself, I'm sure not going to spend time looking for halos in something this master mineralogist has told me doesn't have any halos. So anyway, however, in 1968 now, after I went on a field trip for the General Conference, came back and I said to myself, I'm going to go through every piece of mica that I have in my laboratory. And I came across this piece of mica that I didn't know where it came from. And I looked and looked and looked. And what do you know? I had been looking and praying for giant radioactive halos for years. And all of a sudden, in putting those pieces of mica under the microscope, there they were, giant radioactive halos. And I thought to myself, what in this world has happened? Giant radioactive halos, what I'm looking for. But at that particular time, you see, I didn't know where they all came from. But anyway, here I am now coming back from Russia, 1969. I was there in May Day in 1969. And I decided to go back and see Ramdor again, get more samples. They had moved now from the old University of Heidelberg to a new university, Max Planck, Heidelberg. And he had a brand new system, put all his minerals in different cases and everything. But anyway, he picked out some samples to give me again, and we had this nice friendly conversation, except now we're in a different building. But he still had that same round table. And at the end, I was sitting across from him like I was years earlier, okay? This time, however, as I began to leave, he again leaned over and said, I want to give you this sample of mica. It was the other half of the sample that he had given me years earlier. And he said again, it didn't have any radioactive halos. Now, when I got back to the laboratory there at CUC, of course, I recognized a miracle had been wrought. Year and a half earlier, he had given me the sample and said no radioactive halos. Year and a half later, he says the same thing to me again. But this time, I recognize that's the other half. I won't go into all the details except to say that was one of the reasons, the discovery of those halos. And indeed, when I went to Oak Ridge, one of the first reports I published there in August of 1970, after going there in 1969, one of the first papers I published, Giant Radioactive Halos, Indicators of Unknown Alpha Radioactivity. Don't have time to go into all the details and ups and downs. That line of research is still going on. Well, let's continue. I want to show you now, just very, very briefly, the reports that were published there while I was at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. We'll have to do it very, very quickly. Anyway, science. Again now, every paper I sent in went through the same extensive peer review process. I was again laying a foundation paper after paper after paper, showing that indeed those polonium halos existed only because of this unique primordial radioactivity in the halos to begin with. And this is from the Annual Review of Nuclear Science. You only get to you have to be invited to write a paper for the Annual Review of Nuclear Science or the Annual Review of any field. You have to be established as an authority to do it. And now look at this paper, 1974, paper in Science. I could go on and on this afternoon, probably for another hour, to show you or to tell you about things relating to the publication of this paper. But look at the title. Remember we said earlier that the first referee had said, did Gentry say indeed this has got cosmological significance? Are they primordial and so forth? So I wanted to drive that point home to the scientific community. So I labeled then the actual paper, Radio Halos and Radiochronological. That means things relating to dating, radioactive dating, and cosmological perspective. That means the origin of all the elements in the universe. Very, very clear. You couldn't escape it. And this paper, if you have a chance to read it, want to read it, it's there, of course, on my website. Over and over again, hitting at the point very, very, very hard that indeed we found evidence to show that indeed all the fundamental assumptions of radioactivity, age of the Earth, geologic column, things like that, and the Big Bang, the foundational assumptions are wrong. Well, I expected of all things, that indeed, I was going to get an uproar from the scientific community. The people in the laboratory were letting me stay there as a guest scientist. They saw all these papers being published. They saw me challenging the scientific community. Now, different from academia, the Oak Ridge National Laboratory and the national laboratories are involved in doing research for the government. And the reason the laboratories exist is because Congress expects those at the laboratories to publish papers. It's the lifeblood of a laboratory to have papers published. I was doing something which 90%, 95, 99% of the actual employees, I was there as a guest scientist, were not doing. Over and over again, I was submitting my papers to Science and to Nature and so forth, and they were being published. When they came out, the people in the laboratory said to themselves, how is this happening? But they didn't ever come to me and say, Bob, what are you saying here? You're challenging everything. They looked at the results. They knew that if anything was wrong, they would get an avalanche of negative comments from scientists all over the world. That didn't happen. They kept renewing my guest position. In 1977, a gentleman from the Research Communications Network assayed these scientists, world-renowned scientists, Nobel laureates, and put it in the form of this mystery of the radio halos. What does it say? We don't have time to go into it, except to say that indeed, maybe I'll find something here about it. Looks like I won't for just a minute. Anyway, this challenge, he put out very, very clearly how the papers I'd published had challenged the foundations of all of the Big Bang, geologic evolution, and everything else, and quoted several of the letters. If you go to my website, Mystery of the Radio Halos, you can actually read those letters. I don't have time this afternoon. Then are any unusual radio halos evidence for CHE, super heavy elements, long paper there, time measured responses from EOS, Transactions of the American Geophysical Union. I brought out, because there was a geologist who actually questioned, whether what was going on here. And so I had the opportunity then to respond to some comments he had made as if, this cannot be. Whatever Gentry is doing, it cannot be true. Well, the second half of that was me responding. Took a long time for the AGU to decide to give me the opportunity to respond. You can read all about it. Polonium halos, Transactions in the American Geophysical Union. Again now, another response. Basically, make it very, very plain that indeed the foundational assumptions which the geologists have been working on for decades and for a century or more were factually incorrect. Radioactive halos and a radiochronological and cosmological perspective. That's the same title I used in my 1974 science paper, except now This was the paper I presented. I was invited to present. The evolutionists got together and they said, things have gone too far. We got to have this symposium. We'll invite a couple of creation scientists. We'll have 6 or 8 evolutionists to speak at this symposium. We're going to wipe creation scientists off the face of the earth. Well, they did. And one of the creation scientists that was originally invited to speak dropped out. I said, I'll volunteer to come, and they accepted me. And so I presented then what I'm telling you this afternoon. And I see at least one person here today, I think was at that particular symposium. You can go and read what I said in the papers. But basically, the idea is simply the following. If indeed the granite rocks are in the process of natural origin, then it's inescapable that you should be able to duplicate a granite in the laboratory over and over and over again. I've made that point very, very strongly here, especially at the meeting there in Santa Barbara. Well, I also said that indeed, if geologists are in the world or anyone could actually duplicate a piece of granite, just a hand-sized piece of granite, and also a polonium halo in the granite, I would say you've won. That indeed these are of natural origin. Well, that didn't happen. In any event, radioactive halos implications for creation, the proceedings of the First International Conference on Creationism in 1987. You just have to read the paper again. I emphasize going to these meetings with a large contingent of evolutionists. Look, guys, you got these polonium halos. If you feel that they're just of natural origin, that means you should be able to duplicate them in the laboratory in the here and now. No. You can't do that. You can't tell us to do that. That's the basis of science. I said, you're not working on scientific principles. You've got ideas that have been mentored down to you from 100 years ago. You're not accustomed to anyone challenging you to do something that normally physicists are always accustomed to doing, generally speaking. If you have a theory, you've got to be able to validate the principal assumptions or no good at all. I said you had these theories about the origin of the Earth, the age of the Earth, and things like this. You had your theories about the origin of granite over millions and hundreds of millions of years of time, but you never validated it. And I said, I've tried to do that. In fact, we'll tell you a little bit more about that in just a minute. Anyway, it became very, very evident at that meeting, for example, in Santa Barbara, 1982. One of the preeminent biologists there saw me challenging the geologists. And I know that from behind the scenes, he went to the geologists who were there. And he said to them, why is it that you guys, this is a simple thing, isn't it? All Gentry is asking you to do is to verify that indeed you've got the truth with respect to the origin of granite and the polonium halos. Why don't you go ahead and duplicate a piece of granite? I couldn't do it. Anyway, then again, something very unusual. In working on these pieces of mica and so forth, one day I found under the microscope this very, very unusual design. This is something that was actually in the mica itself, like a pair of spectacles formed by the decay of a whole series of polonium-210 halos. Anyway, enabled me to write indeed a full article for Nature. And again, I pointed out that indeed you've got something here in the isotope ratios of the lead, as well as the halos itself, that unequivocally show that indeed this was not part of a natural sequence of events. Then in 1976, published a paper. People are always asking, well, how do you know for sure that these polonium halos did not arise from uranium decay and so forth? So the Lord of heaven and earth helped me to find where in this earth there were pieces of coalified wood from the Colorado Plateau in Colorado, Arizona, and so forth, that actually had been immersed in water and also near a uranium deposit, and uranium had dissolved and actually immersed into the coalified wood. Coalified plasticism at that time, it was before it turned to actual rock or wood itself. It was wood, but it immersed in water, of course, it swelled and allowed the uranium solution to go through. Bottom line is that uranium and all the daughter products were then available to be captured in the wood, in the water-laden wood. And that's what happened, and I saw that. Turns out that there were secondary polonium-210 halos of one type only, polonium-210, which has the 138-day half-life. The other two halos 138, the 3-minute half-life, the 164 microsecond half-life, polonium 214 and 218, they're nowhere to be found. The isotope ratios of the lead in the centers of the qualified wood polonium halos is so different, vastly different than the isotope ratios, lead ratios of the halos in granites. Too much to go into the details today. Then I testified at the Arkansas creation trial, and before leaving at that particular point in time, I got a lot of people upset with me at the laboratory because up until that time I was just publishing. But at the Arkansas creation trial, I went public with respect to the implications, and the people at the laboratory, as a result of some very, very negative comments from science correspondents who were evolutionists, they asked me to leave or to cease my affiliation with the laboratory as a guest scientist. But before I did, I actually published a paper in Science in, I think it was about March or thereabouts of 1982 now. And it went through the review process at the time I was speaking there at the Arkansas creation trial. Differential lead retention in zircon's implications for nuclear waste containment. Bottom line is that indeed, before I left the laboratory, I actually found evidence showing that indeed the long-term storage of nuclear waste can be accomplished by encapsulating nuclear waste in synthetic zircons. Published the paper. And that's then the laboratory said, well, you know, you're not doing anything of any value anymore and so forth. This went before the United States Senate. And in my book, if you want to know the details, it's all in my book. The United States Senate, Senator Thad Cochran, had this particular paper published by acclaim, the entire Senate record, because he said this man, along with his colleagues there at Oak Ridge, has found the solution to the long-term storage of nuclear waste, and it's not the salt domes there in Nevada. But anyway, I tried my best to get that issue prominent so that the laboratory would let me stay there at Oak Ridge, and indeed it didn't happen. I got in touch with, you can read the story here in the book, got in touch with the Department of Energy and tried to get someone there to help me to stay at the laboratory, and they said we couldn't do it. We made an attempt, but he said those people, they don't want you to stay any longer. But he said to me, what is going on? Here you've published a paper that's come to the United States Senate, been basically published in the Senate record by acclaim. All sorts of wonderful things have been said about it. You've got this paper that's in the headlines of today's news about nuclear waste containment, and they're asking you to leave your guest position. They're hardly paying you anything. I said, what? He said, what is going on? I said, what's going on is that I testified for creation at the Arkansas creation trial. And it's an embarrassment to them. Anyway, then I published another paper before I left, not only differential lead retention in zircons, but differential helium retention in zircons. Again, the implications for the long-term storage of nuclear waste. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. And by the way, most of you, or many of you, know of Institute for Creation Research. I had a very, very good friend, Russ Humphreys. Russ contacted me several years ago, and he said, Bob, we feel this work you've done here about the lead retention in zircons and the helium retention in zircons needs, if possible, to be verified, because we got tremendous evidence here for the rapidity enhanced decay processes. So I helped him as much as I could, told him what I did. They reproduced the results, published it, and indeed, better than, I didn't have time to hardly finish the paper before I had to leave. Anyway, Russ Humphreys and others, if you go to the ICR website, you'll find that the calculations showing the results of these experiments come out to be of the order of 5,600, 5,700 years, plus or minus a couple of hundred years, for the age of the Earth. 5,700 years for the age of the Earth. That's very, very close. That's within experimental error, of course, of the 6,000 years. Anyway, after indeed the laboratory asked me to leave and so forth, I thought to myself, you know, I never have as yet resolved the situation with respect to the Big Bang. Now, in leaving the laboratory as I did, we want you to understand, of course, that basically we had established going through the review process over and over and over again for 13 years of some of the eminent scientists in America, especially if you go back and read the Research Communications Network article. You'll see that indeed they've got letters there from Nobel laureates. One man saying, indeed, that Gentry needs to keep pressing this issue, of shaking this issue in our faces because something is going on we don't understand. That's the Research Communications Network publication, 1977. Again, it's in the appendix of the book. But anyway, as I left the laboratory, I realized that indeed, although there is evidence, see, remember we said there were two foundational assumptions for the Big Bang. One foundational assumption was that indeed the origin of the elements, the origin of the chemical elements, heavy chemical elements, was in the distant past, hundreds of millions, maybe billions of years ago. And indeed, we're saying that within the context of the scientific work, the discoveries, others recognize that these primordial polonium halos identify the actual time period of the origin of the chemical elements throughout the universe. So in other words, we've got proof that indeed the God of heaven left this information, these results in this world, placed them there so that in these days it can be understood that Big Bang and everything connected with it, that fundamental assumption is wrong, never has been right, was never validated. See, the Big Bang, as we said before, was accepted, but the fundamental assumptions were never validated. The other issue, though, was still the question of the redshift. Now, Big Bang cosmology, as we're going to see, has an unusual interpretation of the redshift. We're going to talk about that right now. And this is now a new redshift interpretation that I published in 1997. Now, I'll give my associate at that particular time, David, a lot of credit for working with me as this paper went forward to publication. What is it all about? And then, of course, we published, again at that particular time, the Genuine Cosmic Rosetta, and you can see his name was on that paper. Now, we're going to talk about the significance of this paper in particular as well as the other paper in just a few minutes. What is this archive, by the way? Well, the archive was started at Los Alamos National Laboratory by a scientist there who wanted to find a way for scientists all over the world to get papers out to the worldwide scientific community overnight. In other words, you could actually write a paper and send it into the archive that night by 10 p.m., and it would be listed on the archive for the next day and be distributed to the world. In other words, wherever you are in the world, if you go on to the archive the next day, you'll find a whole bunch of papers that were submitted the night before. This paper and this other paper, Genuine Cosmic Rosetta, the new redshift interpretation affirmed, these were all papers that related to the archive, were printed on the archive. I sent them in, I had a password and so forth, and they were printed there on the archive for everyone to see. However, things didn't stay that way. Tell you what happened. Because I was trying, first of all, let me go back. A new redshift interpretation, that was the first paper I published showing something was actually physically wrong with the redshift interpretation, which is the second foundational assumption of Big Bang cosmology. Now that went through to publication. And someone wrote in to the editor and said, we feel Gentry's guy made a mistake here and so on and so forth. And the editor said, this is what was sent in, and do you want to respond? I said, of course I want to respond. He said, okay, I won't print what they have said about your work till I get your response. I said, fair enough. But guess what? In a short period of time, he went ahead, the editor now of Modern Physics Letters A, which is where this paper was published, he went ahead and he published their response before getting mine. Now, what has that done? That left the worldwide scientific community with the idea that I did not have a response. Because, see, normal scientific etiquette is if someone attacks you, you're always given the opportunity to respond in the same issue where the criticism has been published. He didn't do that. Those authors said to him, we don't want to wait for Gentry to respond to this. We want you to publish our negative criticism of his right away. He bowed to the pressure, published their report. And from then on, basically every time I was trying to get my response published, the editors of the other journals, physics journals, were saying, no, no, these other guys, they've shot you down, you're full of error, and on and on and on. And I would point out to them, read the paper that I'm sending to you, not just what you think about it. They wouldn't do that. What's going on back of the scenes? We might as well let you know. Big Bang cosmology has grasped the throat of cosmologists and physicists all over the world. It is a reason why the physics community, and I speak kindly when I say it, I'm a physicist, have come to be understood and believed to be the God scientists of the world. And to be frank with you, they're not about to willingly give up that status. They're not about to willingly let me present the evidence for the errors in the Big Bang expansion redshift. So, what does that bring us to? Why does it say CERN preprint down here instead of the archive? It's because the fellow in charge of the archive, I had a password, I was freely able to actually publish on the archive as much as I wanted to. But in 2001, because I was having difficulty going through the editors of physics journals, I wrote 10 scientific papers outlining in great detail the problems with the Big Bang and showing why the fundamental assumption was wrong. 10 papers, and submitted them to the archive for publication that night. Well, they wrote back and said, no, you'll have to actually combine all your 10 papers into one in order to get it published. I basically said, you don't have the authority to tell me you're not being paid to do this. And so I said, I want to stay where I was. Sent the papers in again. They deleted the papers the second time. This time they took away my password. So for the past 10 or 11 years now, I've been unable to actually publish anything detrimental about the Big Bang or anything else with respect to this archive. So what I have done, however, at least before it was closed up on me as well, it says the discovery of a major contradiction in Big Bang cosmology. For those of you who want to read the actual problems, scientific problems with the Big Bang, you can go to CERN. Go just type in CERN preprints and so forth, put in my name, and you'll come up with 2 preprints. This one, Discovery of the Major Contradiction in Big Bang Cosmology, and also there's another one. Basically, New Cosmic Center Universe Model. In other words, we have a new model of the universe. The new model of the universe does not have anything connected with Big Bang's expansion redshift. Now, let me say this. The expansion redshift is what Big Bang cosmologists used to say that indeed there's no center to the universe. There's no center to the universe. Stop and think about it. When Edwin Hubble published his paper back in 1929, it was the result of him using the telescope there on Hale, the Hale telescope, and looking at the universe in every direction. And in doing so, he found there was this linear relationship between the distance and the redshift. Okay? Now, because he saw the galaxies moving away from Earth, essentially, in an orderly fashion in every direction, the simplest explanation of his discovery was that indeed the Earth is very, very near to the center of the universe. Okay? Now, what did Edwin Hubble actually say? If I've got things relating to this, way I should have. Here's the archive here before they deleted everything. And what I say is that it matches 8 of Big Bang's major predictions without the Friedmann-Lemaitre space-time expansion paradigm. Okay, what it amounts to is the following. Edwin Hubble came across after he published his paper, and he said there was no center to the universe. Forget about that. That the real explanation for all the data that he had accumulated was that the universe was everywhere the same. The universe is everywhere the same, the so-called cosmological principle. He said, because the universe is everywhere and the same, that means that if you were then transported from this Earth to a distant reaches of the galaxy or the galaxies of the universe, and you looked out with a telescope, you'd see the same result that Edwin Hubble saw. And so therefore, what does it say? He basically established the idea in the minds of the cosmologists of that day. They agreed with him, and it's gone around the world to the effect there is no center of the universe, nothing special about our point of location. And as a result of that, what does that do? Well, it takes away the evidence that the God of heaven wanted everyone to understand. They wanted Edwin Hubble in 1929, when he published his paper, he should have stood up and said, look, folks, here's the situation. There's only one valid explanation for my results, and that is that it's a Doppler effect. Everyone knows of the Doppler effect. If you're traveling down the road and the policeman is there and he's timing you and so forth, it's because he sends a beam of radiation to your car and it comes back to his detector, and it tells him then in the change in the wavelength how fast you're going. Well, as Hubble then saw the change in the wavelength, the redshift of the distant galaxies getting greater and greater and greater with greater and greater distances, it was very, very simple. That should have been Occam's razor. Occam's razor in science is simply that you believe the simplest explanation before you get to a more difficult explanation of the phenomena. That's what Edwin Hubble should have done. He didn't do it. Behind the scenes, if you look into it, you will find that indeed the other astronomers of the day did not want God in the center of the universe any more than whatever, Edwin Hubble himself. Goes back to the days of Napoleon and Laplace, the very, very, very famous French mathematician who took Newton's equations and he developed theories, of course, for celestial motion of all the planets. He and Napoleon were very, very good friends. And once he wrote and finished his thesis and gave Napoleon a copy of it, Napoleon read it. He said, well, I don't understand all the mathematics, but there's one thing I don't understand either. How can you write a treatise on celestial mechanics of the orderly revolutions of the planets and still not mention God? And Laplace came back to Napoleon and said, I have no need of that hypothesis. What we need to understand is this whole plan of excising God from the universe in terms of the theories. It's been going on for hundreds of years. But it really came to the fore when Hubble discovered his redshift relation, and instead of coming out and telling everyone this, basically, this means the galaxies are actually moving away either from our point of location or from a very, very nearby point of where we are. Well, it turns out that indeed the cosmic center model that you can read about, there is a center of the universe that's very, very nearby the Earth. For all practical purposes, astronomically speaking, this center is close enough by so it appears, if you're looking out astronomically to the universe, it appears as if everything is really moving away from us. So in any event, in trying over and over and over again to get this material published, over and over again, I reached the offices then of the editors of the various physics journals of the world. And over and over and over again, they respond in such a way to present blatant fabrications to actually deny publication. What am I doing about this? Well, this has been going on, of course, with the archive now for 11 years, and it's been going on with other physics publications for almost a similar length of time. So over the years, I tried to publish, as I said, in the world's preeminent physics journals, and it goes back to the issue of the editorial integrity of the editors themselves. Inevitably, every time I've sent it in to many, many, many physics journals, the editors end up saying things and making comments which are just out of the wall. And so I wondered how to respond to that. And I'll just give you a little insight into how things have gone recently. I'm a member of several different scientific societies, some of which, of course, have physics offices and so forth. And over the last several years, I've wanted to actually present this material, and I wanted to present the eras and the way in which these editors have very, very unfairly pictured my results. I wanted to actually get that to the top individual in one of the physics journals. But I thought I didn't really know how to do it, because I figured that what I was going to say was going to be so detrimental to the people in his own office that the head man would say, there's no way in the world that my editors would ever have done what you say they've done. So I was looking for a way to actually get in touch with the person in charge of the particular journal I'm talking about. And here, I won't say how long ago it was, I was able, in God's great providence, to actually meet this man. And I told him point blank what had been happening. Not only that, I saw one of the editors who had been misrepresenting my work. And I told him, I said, now I'm confronting you with what you've done, and the top man is here. I want us both to have a conversation. I want to present to the person in charge what you've been doing, and present it to him in such a way that you will have opportunity to respond. Anyway, the bottom line is I was able to do that to the person in charge of this particular journal and so forth. And more than that, other things developed that allowed me to actually present my scientific results to the top editor in person. And he listened cordially. And at the end he said, well, we're going to have to see about this. Meaning, of course, that he understood me to say that he had editors in his own bailiwick that had misrepresented the actual results that I had sent in and had lied about it. And I said, you know, one way or the other, one way or another, I can't let this just go on and on and on. This is why I'm approaching you in a friendly manner before I send something in. He said he understood that and he appreciated that. He did not at that particular time say he was going to take any specific action. He simply said, I'm going to see about it. I'm giving you this information to help you to understand that as far as possible, I'm trying to communicate with the world's leading evolutionists, cosmologists about the Big Bang. To help them to understand that indeed the only reason they're successful is because they had a giant cover-up of the disproof of the Big Bang model that I presented. And they were refusing, up until now at least, to release the papers for publication. Before we go any further then, let me just read something to you to show you my efforts to try to communicate this to those in positions of responsibility and power within the scientific establishment here in America. What I have before me is a press release that I sent out now in February 16, 2010. I was in the process of presenting a poster at the American Physical Society meeting there in Washington, D.C. In conjunction with that, I sent out a press release. On February 16, in the Zinger Room of the National Press Club, creation scientist Robert Gentry brings to public attention the scientific community's censorship of his overthrow of Big Bang cosmology by disproof of his central assumption as reported in his 2/16/10 American Physical Society poster at the D.C. Marriott Wardman Park Hotel. And then follows, of course, the main body of the press release. The National Press Club event enlarges on this theme, that is the cover-up, by documenting how Cornell University's president, David Skorton. Why was I mentioning David Skorton? It's because the archive started at Los Alamos. It was transferred then to Cornell University several years later, about 2003. And since that time, my efforts then to get my password back have been through Cornell University, letters directly to Dr. David Skorton. So I'm basically saying that I'm documenting how Cornell University's president, David Skorton, has allowed himself to enmesh the university in this major denial of academic freedom by his approval of Cornell's archive administrator, Paul Ginsburg's continuing effort to keep the public from learning of this disproof of Big Bang's central assumption, and why this Big Bang gate may yet qualify as modern science's darkest moment. Translated in simple terms, I was sending a letter, this press release, to the world, but saying indeed, David Skorton has allowed himself and allowed Cornell University to be involved in this cover-up, and I don't think he knows what's going on. Go on to say Congress has been unaware of its multi-billion-dollar allocations were for the greatest scientific debacle of all time, the Big Bang. Nevertheless, Gentry believes it is only fair that cosmologists should be given opportunity to publicly respond to his discovery before Congress reconsiders its Big Bang support. To facilitate this, I requested a return fax from the National Academy of Sciences President, Ralph Cicerone. National Academy of Sciences is, of course, America's most elite scientific organization, made up of a huge number of Nobel laureates. I'm basically saying that to facilitate this, he's requested a return fax from Ralph Cicerone, the president of the National Academy of Sciences, from Science Editor, the magazine that I published most of my papers in. Editor was now Bruce Alberts, and from National Center of Science Education's executive editor, Eugenie Scott. Well, Bruce Alberts is the one that has been very, very, very foremost in telling the world that indeed, there is no evidence of creation. Ralph Cicerone is published through his publications there at the National Academy of Sciences. He said there is no evidence of creation science. And lastly, Eugenie Scott is the lady that goes around. She's in charge of this National Center of Science Education, very, very strongly pro-evolution, going around and telling everyone there is no scientific evidence for creation, none whatsoever. So I sent it to these three. I sent an email to those three individuals. And I said, I'm inviting them, this invitation is for them to come and bring a renowned cosmologist with them to meet with me on a friendly, live, national TV forum so that the public and Congress may see firsthand whether my discovery can be refuted, and if not, why evolution's highest scientific echelons continue to heavily censor it. That's the third time I've sent a letter like this to the highest scientific authorities in America, basically saying that indeed you won't let me get in the door to justify more of the scientific discoveries I made. You're closing the door. It's a cover-up of huge proportions. But I said the least you could do if you're going to do that is to agree to bring in these world authorities that you claim have all the truth. Come and meet with me on national TV, a live national forum. I'm offering this opportunity. This was now the third time. No response. Except that, in saying this, Eugenie Scott, she did say, well, I'm out of town. I can't come to your meeting there at the National Press Club. That opened the door for me to have a friendly email conversation with Eugenie Scott. And I said, Eugenie, I said, dear Eugenie, if I may. She said, dear Robert, if I may. So it was a very cordial response, email conversation we had. I said, Eugenie, here's the situation. You're out telling the world there is no published evidence for creation. But in fact, you know for sure that indeed, in the 1982 presentation there at Santa Barbara, Evolutionists Confront Creationists, you know for sure you heard me speak and basically challenge the entire scientific community to come forward and present, or synthesize a piece of granite, or synthesize polonium halos. And I said, everything hinges and falls on that simple experiment. You heard me say that over and over again. You heard one of the leading biologists there say to the geologists, why haven't you guys done this? So Eugenie, you know for sure that what you're saying to the public about there not being evidence for creation is really not factual. Why don't you open the door? Well, anyway, we had, as I said, a friendly email conversation. And I said, why would you continue to make statements that are not factual and are leading people astray? Ordinary people listen to you, and they have the idea from what you say that the God of heaven doesn't have any existence whatsoever. People are actually being deceived. People are going to be lost forever because they believe what you said instead of what the Bible says. I approached her to the very best of my ability in a way that would appeal to her sense of justice. Thus far, It has not worked. In other words, she has not responded positively. Let me continue. There's more, hopefully, if I haven't, I've got everything here. Remember we said earlier, this is where we started saying that indeed this 1968 paper that was published with the polonium halos, remember I said, the referee said, extinct radioactivity and so forth. He's saying this is true, that indeed something is wrong, something is badly wrong. You've got extinct natural radioactivity, and it applies not only just to the granite rocks, it applies to the radioactivity that is extinct, the primordial radioactivity, the cosmological implications of the radioactivity, applies to all the matter in the universe. God, the Creator, left his fingerprints of creation of the earth as an example of what he did for the universe. And remember, this is what we said also, that indeed the Big Bang theory is the helium and hydrogen stars form the supernova. They believe that this distance between, or the time between the supernova and the actual present, is billions of years. Whereas basically we're saying that indeed this is what they're saying, the supernova billions and billions of years ago for the extinct natural radioactivity. What we really had is that the creation account encompasses that one day, whatever the Lord spoke during creation week, he brought the elements into existence, the stars into existence there on day 4. Well, all of this, as I said, came out in the proceedings of the 63rd annual meeting of the Pacific Division of the American Association of Advancement of Science. We've already talked about that. And here again, we're emphasizing to those who came that these polonium halos apply not only to radiochronological data, the whole idea of being able to use radioactivity to make estimates of the age of the Earth, it's all wrong. It's all wrong. The fundamental assumption, the halos show that indeed, instead of all these rocks accumulating from time to time over hundreds of millions and millions of years, it was all the result. The basement granite rocks of this world were all created at day 1 and created in essentially in a very rapid fashion within that several minute time period. Talked about the mystery of the radio halos, which I suggest to you, you need to go and look at. What does it say? Now remember, this was after I was there publishing for several years at the laboratory. 1975 is when letters were sent out from this research communication network outfit. Went out to these major science figures of the 20th century, several of whom were Nobel laureates, others were of that stature. Here's what it says. Current physical laws may not have governed the past. This is what this man got as a result of reading my papers. Earth's primordial crustal rocks, rather than cooling and solidifying over millions of years, crystallize almost instantaneously. Some geological formations thought to be 100 million years old are in reality only several thousand years old. Now, this information, as I said, was accumulated from our reports and also in conjunction with letters that were sent to the world's eminent scientists of the 20th century. Here's what the summary is. Grant these propositions that we just read. Any researcher will tell you the entire structure of the historical natural sciences would dissolve into formlessness. Few certainties would remain, yet these possibilities and others equally disintegrative have been published over the past several years in the world's foremost scientific journals, Nature, Science, Annual Review of Nuclear Science, among others. That's the format in which this particular report was published. Guess what? It went to all the higher echelons individuals at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. This was not done in silence. They had day by day and week after week and year after year seen me publish these papers and wondered what is going to come next. They were wondering, why is it that no one is responding to these results that challenge the entire scientific community's idea of what is truth? Now, those of you who are physicists here today will recognize the name of John Wheeler. John Wheeler is one of the individuals that was assayed as a result of this inquiry about the implications of my work. You asked my opinion of Dr. Robert Gentry's work on polonium halos. I've already indicated to you I did not get a PhD. So the reference here to a doctor, of course, is either mistaken or I did get an honorary degree. But anyway, let me clarify, I do not have a PhD. John says, I spent a number of hours reviewing this fascinating work with him some weeks ago. I was in the company of John Wheeler. Anyone who wants to know more about John Wheeler can go put his name into Google and you'll find out a long, long list. He was one of the two scientists who wrote the first report on nuclear fission. He and Niels Bohr. I think it was back in 1839. I was impressed with the clarity of the evidence for the anomalous halos, the polonium halos. That is, cases where there are rings indicating the presence of some members of the normal radioactive decay chain without other members of the family tree that normally are present, that normally do show up in rings of their own, and that have to be there on present views of radioactive decay chains. That was John Wheeler. If the evidence is impressive, the explanation for it is far from clear. I would look at normal geologic processes of transfer of materials by heating and cooling, and isomeric nuclear transitions, and in every other standard physical phenomenon, before I would even venture to consider cosmological explanations, let alone radical cosmological explanations. To explore all the avenues that need exploring would take months, not a few hours I was privileged to spend in Dr. Gentry's company. That's what I had been doing for years before John wrote these words. All these other avenues had been investigated. Now, why was John writing this and equivocating to the point that indeed I would do all these things, I would look everywhere in the world before I would consider these radical cosmological implications? What he's talking about is that these polonium halos basically certify the indeed origin of the chemical elements of the universe like that, about 6,000 years ago, biblically. What I'm saying is we need to understand that back of the scenes, there are Nobel laureates I've talked to. There are eminent scientists I've talked to over and over again over the years that have come very, very close. In fact, they've understood for sure that this is evidence, as I understand it, evidence for creation. They understand all the details, nuclear physics and otherwise, but have been unwilling to step out from their point of view or their. John Wheeler was an eminent scientist of the world. All these men were eminent scientists of the world at the time this was taken and remained so until the time they passed away. They were unwilling to step out and say that we've been wrong, that the God of Genesis really has done something here that we can't understand. Whether we can understand it or not, there's the evidence, hard evidence, and the world needs to know about it. So in each instance, even though the men were able to understand the implications, what they were unable to do was to bring themselves to the point of saying something in public to the effect that indeed, folks, we've been deceiving you. The world has been flummoxed, and there are a lot of evolutionists who know about it and have been unwilling to admit it. This is now from one of the other individuals that was assayed, Ed Anders, University of Chicago. This is now in this Research Communications Network report that I'm referring to. Gentry's conclusions are startling. They shake the foundations of radiochemistry and geochemistry. And he's been meticulous in experimental work. Now get this. Here's Ed Anders saying, I've been so restrained in his interpretations that most people take his work seriously. I think most people believe, as I do, that some unspectacular explanation will eventually be found for the anomalous halos, the polonium halos, and that orthodoxy will turn out to be right after all. This is now 1975-77. Meanwhile, Gentry should be doing what I'm doing this afternoon. Be encouraged to keep rattling the skeleton in our closet for all its worth. You need to understand that they have a worldview that they've incorporated into their lives. And barring a miracle of God's providence, they will agree that indeed something is there that they don't understand. But in terms of bringing it out the truth to the average person on the street, such as yourself, to say unequivocally, wait a minute, there's only really one way. It's not that hard. The God of heaven said he spoke the heavens into existence. It's right there in the same commandment he wrote with his own finger and gave to Moses on Mount Sinai. But you see, they don't believe that anymore. They don't believe in the Ten Commandments. They don't believe in the God of heaven doing this. So therefore, this is where we are this afternoon. Well, along the line that I was at the laboratory, and this is the reason that I was asked to leave, I went to the Arkansas creation trial. Before I went, basically what had happened is that the state of Arkansas had passed a law requiring the teaching of creation science in the public school. ACLU basically challenged the law. I was called to go and testify for the state. I knew before I went that indeed by so doing that I was going to put myself in a very, very extraordinary position with the laboratory, because I was almost certain that indeed the ACLU was going to misrepresent what I said, if at all possible. And this is exactly what happened. Well, first of all, let me say this. Renowned geologist Dr. G. Brent Dalrymple receives the National Medal of Science from President Bush on 3/14/05. Why do I bring him up? Who is he? World-renowned geologist G. Brent. You can see the renowned character of this man by getting the National Medal of Science in 2005. Why do I bring his name up? Well, it turns out that G. Brent Dalrymple is the geologist that the ACLU brought into the Arkansas creation trial to try to overturn this evidence for creation. They brought in the very best they could possibly find in all the world. G. Brent Dalrymple, at that time acting director of the Western Division of the U.S. Geological Survey. They figured if anyone in this world that can overturn that evidence, Brent Dalrymple is going to be the one, because if he doesn't do that, we've lost. Now, this is what I'm quoting now, is what Brent Dalrymple said on the witness stand there at the Arkansas creation trial. I have excerpted in the book part of Brent Dalrymple's testimony. This is part of it. You can read more of it. If you want to read the entire part, Brent Dalrymple actually had his entire testimony placed on the website. This is what he said on the witness stand now. In Gentry's work, he proposed a very tiny mystery which is balanced on the other side by an enormous amount of evidence. I think it's important to know what the answer to that little mystery is. If you have, now listen to this. This is Brent Dalrymple talking. Previously, when he was asked about my work, Brent said, well, you know, yeah, Gentry's been out there working for a long time, but you know, I really don't know much about it. But now, on the witness stand, here's what he says. If you have a granitic body, a rock that comes from the melt, that contains this mica. Remember, this is what I've talked about, granite coming from a melt. It cools down. This granite body cools down. It takes millions of years for a body like that to cool. That's standard geological theory of the origin of granite. So that by the time the body cooled, the polonium would have decayed. Since it has an extremely short half-life. Decayed meaning it decays away. Billions of years, actually just an hour or so, it's all gone. Several minutes, it's gone. Since it has such an extremely short half-life, it's going to be all gone. Therefore, Brent is saying there would be no polonium in the body to cause the polonium halos. If indeed, he's basically saying, if indeed the granite magma was cooling down over millions of years, there's no way in this world there would be any polonium left by the time the rock cooled to form the polonium halos. That's Brent Dalrymple there on the witness stand. So what Gentry, is saying, this is still quoting now from his testimony, this is primordial polonium. This is what we've been telling you all afternoon. Primordial polonium. Therefore, in other words, it was the only polonium, nothing else was there at the beginning, and because it was primordial, therefore the granite mass in which it occurs could not have cooled slowly. What a tremendous summation. Therefore, it must have been created by fiat instantly. That's Brent Dalrymple talking on the witness stand at the Arkansas creation trial. Now, undoubtedly, Brent, with the ACLU, before the trial began, it was understood that Brent wasn't going to answer any questions at all about the polonium halos. Remember I said earlier, he said, I really don't know anything about this work of Gentry and so forth. But now he got to the point, he lost himself and he made this reply. What did that happen at that point in time? You can read in my book. The judge said, "What was that again?" In other words, Brent Dalrymple's remarks got through to the judge. And Bruce Ennis, before Brent Dalrymple had the chance to say anything, Bruce Ennis, the lead attorney for the ACLU, jumps up and he says, Your Honor, there are some things here that are difficult to understand. We'll deal with these later. They almost lost the case right then and there. They would have lost it if indeed everything had been on the up and up, and I'll tell you a little bit about that later. Anyway, here is basically it. The evolutionary theory of granite formation is you've got something molten 1,000, 1,500 degrees, 10 or 12 miles below the surface of the Earth. Hundreds of thousands of years pass, and part of it begins to cool. Many millions of years pass, and the whole thing turns to rock. That's what Brent Dalrymple was saying there on the witness stand of the Arkansas trial. But he was also basically making the comment that if you had this rapid radioactive decay of the polonium and the slow cooling of rock, there would be no halo whatsoever. But if you had rapid radioactive decay and instantly created rock, you would have the permanent halo. That's simple. And that's what Brent was saying. Well, let's go now to a presentation I made in 1987 at the University of Tennessee. The issue there was what the National Academy of Sciences has said about Genesis. And they have this booklet, Science and Creationism, a View from the National Academy of Sciences. Here's what they say in the booklet. This hypothesis, the hypothesis of special creation has, over nearly 2 centuries, been repeatedly and sympathetically considered and rejected on evidential grounds by qualified observers and experimentalists. In the forms given in the first 2 chapters of Genesis, it is now an invalidated hypothesis. To reintroduce it into the public schools at this time as an element of science teaching would be akin to requiring the teaching of Ptolemaic astronomy or pre-Columbian geography. In other words, he's saying, it's all over for creation. This is now after the Arkansas creation trial. I knew there were people who had written part of this booklet who knew that that was a factual untruth for them to say that. So, we'll continue with what the Academy says and then the comments. Confronted by this challenge to the integrity. These people are making it out. They're the ones with the integrity and the effectiveness of our national education system. Like everything hangs in the balance here if we don't do something about creation. To the hard-won evidence based on foundations of science. Foundations. That's what's wrong. They never validated them. The National Academy of Sciences cannot remain silent. To do so would be a dereliction of our responsibility to academic and intellectual freedom and to the fundamental principles of scientific thought. As a historic representative of the scientific profession and designated advisor to the federal government in matters of science, the Academy states unequivocally that the tenets of creation science are not supported by scientific evidence. This is now just a few years after the Arkansas creation trial. Well, here's part of the audience that was there that night at the University of Tennessee. I read part of what you just saw there at the university that night. Here's me in 1987. I was speaking, and I was presenting to the audience the fact that indeed, regardless of what everyone says about belief in evolution and everything, the fundamental assumptions are dead wrong. The fundamental assumptions are dead wrong because you cannot duplicate the origin of granite. You cannot duplicate the polonium halos. I just got through saying that. And it was a piece of granite as an example. I was saying that has never been and can't be reproduced. And that this is a piece of rhyolite, which is in the earth. It's been extracted, of course, from a deep drill hole. I said, basically, the only thing you ever get from melting granite, putting it in the same conditions that exist deep in the earth and so forth, and let it cool slowly, all you get is something like this rhyolite, not something like that piece of granite. I said it fails. At that point in time, there was clapping in the audience. Someone had begun to speak, challenging what I was saying. And it was back about 1/3 of the way in the audience. You could see there was a crowd that night. And I said, you know, I can't really hear what you say. Come down to the front. I had a microphone right there. This is Professor Larry Taylor of the Geology Department of the University of Tennessee. This is where things really became interesting. Larry Taylor, we have it all on videotape. If you want to see it, you want to see the whole story, 2 hours and 40 minutes long. 22-minute segment of that is my interaction with Larry Taylor. In fact, I've got that also just recorded in the book. Larry Taylor was very, very insistent that indeed I was ignorant of the fact that granite had been synthesized many, many times. There have been many, many reports showing the synthesis of granite. And I said, well, that's fine. And he said, furthermore, he said, I can synthesize granite in the laboratory myself. I said, really? I said, how long will it take you to do it? 1 week. I said, can we come back in a week and see it? Then there ensued this exchange between Larry Taylor and myself. And it didn't turn out very well for Larry Taylor. It didn't turn out very well for evolutionists. Because it became evident that night that Larry Taylor said, well, I can't do it at the University of Tennessee, but I can go down to the Johnson Space Center. You're just ignorant. People have done this, the origin of granite, many, many times, duplicated granite many, many, many times. You're ignorant of the facts. And I had a piece of granite in my hand, a small piece of granite in my hand, not a large piece. And I said, you know, this is really, really, really interesting for you to say this tonight. I have a little piece of granite here. Would you mind coming up and taking a look at this piece of granite? The microphone was only several feet from the stage, so I reached over and I gave him this piece of granite. And it was only a small piece. And I said, how long would you think it would take you to do this? I wanted to be very specific on having a piece of granite that he said he could do he said about a week. In other words, he had not changed his view with respect to how long it would take to do that granite. Then ensued a discussion. 1 week. Can we come back and see it? Anyway, it ensued, you will be interested. Anyone who is interested in the creation evolution controversy, anyone who has any doubts at all that the whole evolutionary scenario, that the age of the earth and everything to do with geological time is a farce, needs to go and watch that DVD. Because it shows so clearly that Larry Taylor that night had made such dominant claims about having been able to duplicate granite himself, and that other people had done it. And that indeed I was the one that was ignorant that night of telling all those people there that they needed to believe in creation, because the falsification test, any theory that you have with respect to the past, remember, has got to have foundational assumptions. And those foundational assumptions have got to be validated and shown to be true before you can use it. My whole point that night was the whole idea of geological evolution of the earth, which I understand some individuals in a local university adhere to, as well as the Big Bang, was never validated. And that night, that issue came into prime focus. Well, I waited then, and there was more to it. Interestingly, I wanted to, as far as possible, get to the bottom of this whole issue of whether this was really true or not. So, an evolutionary geologist up north somewhere, he was very, very insistent that indeed granite had been synthesized in the laboratory. And in fact, he said there were experiments done years ago and someplace, and he said that shows that indeed granite is synthesized and it's possible to do it. So I thought, you know, I'm going to check this out for sure, find out what's going on. So I went back and began to do some checking, complete checking. Now I found out that in the 1960s, there was a geologist, C. Wayne Burnham, I think it was at University of Pennsylvania. He had done some experiments trying to synthesize granite in the laboratory. And that indeed a film was made by Encyclopedia Britannica of the outcome of those experiments. Well, I chased down the actual Britannica film and I looked at it, and it was not firm evidence at all. It was very, very equivocal. And I thought, what I really need is the actual sample of rock or product that came out of those experiments that was being claimed now to be granite. Where in the world would I find that? It was decades ago. But I found this geologist. And turns out he was the one that Encyclopedia Britannica filmed. And I said, do you remember doing the experiment? He said, oh, yes, I remember. I said, I'm calling you because I'm in, if at all possible, in great need of your loaning me that sample of rock that was in that series of experiments that presumably showed granite. He said, you've asked a very, very, very difficult question because here I am, I moved out west, Arizona, I believe. He said, my initial work is back there in the University of Pennsylvania. I don't know when I'm going to be going back there. That was decades ago. I have no idea I even saved that sample or not. But he said, I said, well, it would really be appreciated if you would look, if you had opportunity. So that was now about a week or so or more before this program came on, before April 13, 1987. And I waited and waited and waited to hear from him as to whether anything had happened. One day I got a telephone call. It was only a few days before the April 13 meeting. And he said, I went back to home where I lived before, and I went through all my old samples. And guess what? I found the actual piece that came out of the result of that attempted granite synthesis experiment. I said, here it is. What do you want me to do? I said, well, I'm in great need of it right now. I said, I will pay you if you will go down to Delta Airlines. I will pay for Delta Dash to have that sent to me overnight, maybe even today, if you'll do it. He said, if you'll pay for it, I'll do it. So he went down to Delta Airlines, and they had the service Delta Dash, and he sent it. And I picked it up before that evening's presentation at the University of Tennessee. Made a slide of it, took a picture. So when this whole issue came up, at the end of that discussion I had with Larry Taylor, I said, now I have something I want to bring to your attention and the attention of all the audience, and all the geologists, had all these geology students there that night, clapping and whatever. And I explained to him that indeed how I got that sample in detail. And if you go to my website, halos.com, you can actually see it. You can actually view it online, 2 hours and 40 minutes, but 22 minutes of it is this particular interaction. And I said, you have said that you could, in a week, come back and synthesize a piece of granite. I'm saying that's never going to happen. I'm saying you will not be able to do it. Here's proof positive. That experiment has been tried. I've got the sample itself. It went through that experiment. I didn't do it. It was done by Professor Burnham. And here it is. And I showed that slide. I showed that picture of rhyolite next to it. And there it is. That piece of, you can see that piece of bronze, yellow down there, that was a piece of platinum that was in the original envelope. In other words, they took a small piece of granite, put it into a platinum envelope, poured a little bit of water in it. That's basically the whole idea. Heated up to 900 degrees centigrade, melted everything. Then let it cool down over a period of a week or two. Now, when we say that it took hundreds of thousands and millions of years for a huge mountain of granite to supposedly cool, that's one thing. But because in their way of thinking, obviously, the granite is going to cool from the outward surface inward, that means day by day and hour by hour, a certain amount of that magma supposedly is cooling. And the certain amount of magma that's cooling is is just about like this for a couple of hours. And the cooling over there in that experiment was much, much longer than that. So I said that night, if you're able to actually form a piece of granite, synthesize a piece of granite in the laboratory, I'll give you my telephone number. You can call me. I'll make it news not only here in Knoxville, but state news. I'll make it nationwide news that you've been able to do something that no other geologist has been able to do. nor claims to be able to do. Well, program came to a close. A week or so later, I hadn't heard anything. A few days later, I decided, I'm not going to let this rest. So I wrote a letter to Dr. K.R. Walker, who at that time was the chairman of the geology department of the University of Tennessee. And I'm sure he had heard about what happened that Monday night. But I said, Monday night, this is what Dr. Taylor said. I've got a video of it. Granite synthesis has been done many, many, many times, hundreds of times, hundreds of publications. I said, I've been waiting for Dr. Taylor to at least bring me some evidence of those publications. Haven't received anything. Time is passing. And I said, I'm waiting, of course, for the granite synthesis sample. That hasn't happened either. Can you help me out if there's indeed something like this? If Dr. Taylor is telling the truth, why don't you please give me this information? I appreciate receiving an answer from you, Robert Gentry. Sent a letter to Dr. Walker, chairman of the geology department at UT. Guess what kind of answer I got? 1 week, 2 weeks, 1 month, 2 months, 6 months, a year. How about 25 years down the road? The God of heaven knew what he was doing when he created the earth. He wanted everyone to understand that indeed there is scientific verification of the Genesis record of creation of the fourth commandment. The Seventh-day Adventist Church, in my opinion, this is my opinion, needs to take this evidence and present it to the world and say, look, folks, we understand you guys believe in evolution, but it's because of what you say, like the National Academy of Sciences, because you think that it's supported by science. But the very fact of the matter is, you've been deceived, you've been flummoxed. They've been telling you things that aren't true. You want the truth? Here it is. The God of heaven has intervened. When he created this earth, he saw everything that was going to be happening in these days. He wanted to help you all to understand that the Genesis record of creation, the 6 days that God made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, has got scientific validation. And it needs to go, in my opinion, to the world to show that indeed it's no scientific fantasy that the seventh-day Sabbath is a memorial of creation. Let me mention something else in this respect. Seventh-day Adventists believe not only in Revelation 14, 6 through 8. I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach unto them that dwell on the earth, to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people, saying with a loud voice, fear God and give glory to him, for the hour's judgment is come. But then it goes on to say, and worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea, and the fountains of waters. That's the fourth commandment all over again. That's the first of the three angels' messages. Now, if you read chapter 14, you'll find out there are 2 other messages by 2 other angels. And those 2 other messages, for all of you who have read the Bible, they are sober warnings about what is going to be happening on the earth. And when people hear those 2 messages, it's always, whoa, whoa, whoa. How can we believe that the God of heaven has ordained that things are going to come to this point in time? Essence of it all is the God of heaven is telling the truth. If we don't believe the truth, he's basically saying, as far as I'm concerned in the Bible, if people think they're going to get away from this world, disbelieving what he has commanded, what he has said, I don't think it's going to happen. And he's making every effort to try to convince the world of the second and third angel's messages by showing scientific validation of the first one. It's my opinion. Very clear. It's a message that needs to go to the world. And Paul, I think it says, it was time to expose the unfruitful works of darkness in his days. Here's the letter to Walker. Dr. Walker, the meeting there in the University of Tennessee was April 13, 1987. Here I waited until July 7 to write the letter, and I go on to say in the second paragraph, I telephoned Dr. Taylor, intending to ask him his whether he could provide me with the journal references on granite synthesis and whether it had successfully synthesized a piece of granite. I'm reading from the second paragraph there. Whether he actually successfully synthesized a piece of granite in the time since my presentation. After a few brief remarks to the effect that he didn't know who I was at the time of my presentation. What has that got to do with anything? He informed me that he intended to have nothing else to do with me, and then unilaterally abbreviated the conversation without supplying the references. Despite this rebuff, I am still interested in finding out whether references on granite synthesis actually exist. I assume that as head of the Department of Geological Sciences, you either know of the reference of granite synthesis referred to by Dr. Taylor, or Dr. Taylor will supply that information to you. You will then be able to forward the same to me. I look forward to hearing from you about this matter. 25 years have elapsed. Remember Brent Dalrymple, the one that testified there at the Arkansas creation trial? How did he end up? Did he say anything else beyond that? In 1992, let me go first of all to this letter. November 1992, if you look at the upper right corner there, there's a letter from the National Center of Science Education. Eugenie Scott is the director of that. That's the lady that we talked about before, just a while ago. This letter now went out from the National Center of Science Education, and it basically was saying all sorts of unusual things about how creation scientists were getting a little bit of progress. I want to go back to where we were, and we'll show now. This is now what the letter says. I'm writing. Who is I am writing? That's G. Brent Dalrymple. Eugenie Scott is giving G. Brent Dalrymple the opportunity to write a fundraising letter for the National Center of Science Education and send it out to all the members of the American Geophysical Union. How did he do that? It was because a year before, in 1991, he was the president of the American Geophysical Union. He had access to the mailing list of all the members of the AGU, 30, 40,000. This letter went out to all the members of the AGU, and I was a member, and came to the house. I was about ready to throw it away, but Sir David and my wife, Pat, rescued it, began to read it, said, look, Dad, you know, there's something here you need to read. Here's what it says. I'm writing you, Brent Dalrymple, to tell you about the National Center of Science Education, an organization of scientists that defends rational science education. The problem is the fundamentalist opposition to evolution. I know it's hard to believe that evolution can still be a problem in 1992, but the opposition to evolution throughout the US and Canada has actually increased during the last year. The movement is called scientific creationism. It's composed of biblical literalists who claim to have scientific evidence the world was created all at one time, only a few thousand years ago. Some of our colleagues think that the scientific creationist movement can be ignored, but I think they're wrong. The movement is beginning to affect some college classes too. As members of Genesis clubs enter classrooms with disruptive and difficult to answer questions. How would you answer a student who announced in your class the second law of thermodynamics doesn't permit evolution, or that the presence of polonium halos in granite demonstrates the granite had to have formed suddenly, i.e. was specially created? Those are words of Brent Dalrymple that went out to 30,000 at least members of the American Geophysical Union, asking whether can anyone supply this, because we got these kids, Genesis Club's kids, going out to classrooms and they're raising havoc. And I wondered, that was 1992 he wrote that letter. We couldn't believe it. But then in 1995, guess what? There it is. There's another letter from Brent Dalrymple, from Eugenie Scott's National Center of Science Education. What does he say this time? Something very similar. The creation science movement is beginning to affect some college classes as members of Genesis clubs. Same thing he said before in 1992. Enter classrooms with disruptive and difficult to answer questions. Now, previously, he entered in the idea of thermodynamics. Can they explain thermodynamics? He doesn't say that in this letter. How would you answer a student who claims that the presence of polonium halos in granite demonstrates that granite had to have formed suddenly, that it was specially created? That's Brent Dalrymple telling again another 30,000 scientists. I need help. We all need help. What are we going to do with these kids? They're coming in. They're going to destroy us unless we do something. Another plea, another SOS. Guess what? That's the 1995 letter. No response. As a result, evolution is still being taught. Paul Davies, giving you some idea now about the Big Bang itself, switching gears just a tiny bit. Big Bang's miraculous no-God origin of matter reveals the fundamental flaw. Here's what evolutionists actually believe about the origin of you and everybody else in the universe. Anything can come out of a naked singularity. That's just a fancy way of saying that something can come out of nothing when there's no reason for anything to exist to begin with. In the case of the Big Bang, the universe came out of this naked singularity. In other words, you've got to postulate something called the naked singularity in order for the universe to come out of nothing. Its creation represents, listen to this, represents the instantaneous suspension of physical laws. You know what surprises me so much is that creation scientists, in so many cases, in my opinion, are so fearful of mentioning the fact that God of heaven has been at work in the universe, even in the here and now. But here's the fundamental assumption of Big Bang cosmology. Its creation represents this singularity, of no God singularity, represents the instantaneous suspension of physical laws, the sudden, abrupt flash of lawlessness that allowed something to come out of nothing. And listen to what he said. It's a true miracle, transcending physical principle. Isn't it interesting that within Christendom, there are a vast number of people who have great reticence to believe that indeed what the Bible says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning, Lord, you laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. By the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and the heaven, and bringing something out of existence from nothing. In the beginning, Lord, you laid the foundations of the earth, the heavens are the work of your hands. Have great difficulty believing what the Bible says about creation because it involves a miracle. This man, Paul Davies, is saying creation of this universe came out of nothing. The abrupt flash of lawlessness that allowed something to come out of nothing represents a true miracle transcending physical principles. There are people who don't want you to believe in the biblical story of creation with God, the Creator, who are willingly telling the whole world that indeed something came out of nothing with no God whatsoever. Cosmology. You would say, you would think that indeed, if there's something really obviously wrong with the theory, nobody would believe it. Look at the book by Edward Harrison, Cosmology. Listen to what he says now about the non-conservation of energy loss of the Big Bang. Science clings tenaciously to concepts. By the way, Edward Harrison is a preeminent Big Bang cosmologist. Science clings tenaciously to concepts of conservation, the most fundamental of which is the conservation of energy principle. The conservation of energy principle serves us well in all sciences except cosmology. That's the, if you have any, you all have thinking capacity, stop and think what the guy is saying. It serves as well in all sciences except cosmology as if you're going to divorce the rest of the universe and science away from the Big Bang. To the question of where energy goes in an expanding universe and where it comes from in a collapsing universe, the answer is nowhere, because in this one case, energy is not conserved. Can you believe that? That's taught firmly as a part of Big Bang. You're not going to conserve conservation of energy at all. Well, what else? Well, in the Doppler effect, of course, Hubble was expanding, of course, on the explanation of the redshift discovery. We talked about this a little bit before, to the effect that indeed all the galaxies were moving away from us, in a given situation, orderly. And then, how do they explain the Doppler? How do they explain the result that Hubble discovered in 1929 of the redshifts, the galaxies all moving away from us in an orderly fashion? Here's what George Smoot said. He was a Nobel laureate, of course, of a few years ago. We live in a universe whose space is currently expanding. That's the theory. He's not telling you that. The cosmological redshift, that's something different, is due to the stretching of light by the expansion of space. Guess what? They invented the idea, cosmologists invented the idea to get rid of the center of the universe and the Doppler effect. They invented the idea that, remember what we said about Davies a few minutes ago, this instantaneous suspension of physical laws coming out of absolutely nothing. They say something started from absolutely nothing. Then space itself began to expand. Then it says the light from the distant galaxies takes longer to reach us and is thus stretched to longer wavelengths by expanding space than is light by the nearby galaxies. In other words, they are now inventing not only the expansion of space, but now they're going to say the expansion of space is going to expand the wavelengths of light. And this new paradigm, space-time expansion, the Einstein field equations, was assumed to apply to the universe so as to cause space itself to expand in time, assumedly causing galaxies to increasingly separate because wavelengths to increase as space expands. Get rid of the location. What does Edwin Hubble say about his discovery? One of the most amazing things you can imagine in science. Hubble demands a no center everywhere in the same universe, despite the fact such a theory is scientific farce. This is what Hubble says. The assumption is adopted. There must be, this is now Hubble telling the world the interpretation of his result. There must be no favored location in the universe, no center. Edwin Hubble decreed there was no center to the universe, in spite of the fact this was the obvious interpretation. No boundary. All must see the university of light. All must see the universe of light. And in order to ensure this situation, the cosmologist postulates spatial isotropy and spatial homogeneity, which is his way of stating that the universe must be pretty much alike everywhere in all directions. In other words, the whole idea of explaining the Big Bang's redshift, cosmic black-body radiation, the Hubble redshift relation, is an invention, a fantasy. Obviously, Hubble disregarded Occam's razor, the simplest interpretation, in choosing to insist that a previously unknown type of redshift was responsible for the galactic redshift relation. Now, in spite of the fact that indeed the whole world is going down the path of believing all this, Stephen Hawking, the world's premier cosmologist, says this in his book, A Brief History of Time. At first sight, all this evidence that the universe looks the same, whichever direction we look in, seem to suggest there's something special about our place in the universe. In particular, it might seem that if we observe all the galaxies to be moving away from us, then we must be at the center of the universe. That is Stephen Hawking. And in the book before this, the one that sold 20 million copies, there he is admitting. In other words, you see this obvious data, then the conclusion should be, we must be at the center of the universe. But it doesn't stay there. He says, there is, however, an alternate explanation. The universe might look the same in every direction as seen from any other galaxy. This we have seen was Friedman's second assumption. Listen to this. The whole Big Bang then is dependent upon this other assumption. We have no scientific evidence for or against this assumption. You realize that the whole scientific community is believing in something. Stephen Hawking himself says we have no evidence, scientific evidence for or against this assumption. The fact is we do have a lot against it. We believe it only on grounds of modesty. Can you believe that the world's premier cosmologist, one of the best-known scientists in the world, is now saying that indeed this fundamental assumption of Big Bang cosmology is believed because of modesty? What in the world is he talking about? He's saying, look, guys, if we were to say that we've got some place special in the universe, that's not a very modest thing to say. That means that the God of heaven has chosen this universe, this galaxy of ours, to be something very, very close to the universe, the center of the universe. That's not a very modest thing to say. So therefore, we believe it only on grounds of modesty that the universe is the same everywhere. It would be remarkable if the universe looked the same in every direction around us, but not on other points in the universe. In other words, he's going to get rid of all the scientific evidence for the center of the universe by simply saying, it would be remarkable if that were true. It is this theorized wavelength that causes the Big Bang's non-conservation of energy. It says light, photon, or quanta in the universe has lost most of the energy since the Big Bang. Is it true? Of course not. Here's the schematic. Space is expanding. Each one of those boxes represents the expansion of space. See those sine curves there? That basically is the evidence for the expansion of wavelengths. So you start out with something that's a small wavelength that gets larger and larger and larger. And that, see, if a wavelength gets larger, wavelength is inversely proportional to the energy. that means the wavelength has lost energy. You take all the photons in the universe and you make a calculation as to how much it's all lost in terms of the energy. When the sum total of all the expansion shifted photons is computed, the result is the total non-conservation energy loss is more than 30 million times the total mass of all the stars in the galaxies in the visible universe. Something is drastically wrong. In other words, if you take that theory to the ultimate conclusion, you've got non-conservation of energy 30 million times the mass of the universe. Here's a paper that David and I submitted, of course, to the archive back in 1998. Here it is. You can look at it yourself. Go to the archive, QRQC 9806061. Or a copy of it, of course, is on the archive itself. 30 million times the mass of the universe is the non-conservation of energy loss. And people believe this. And they're getting away with believing everyone else believing it. Here's the book, of course, The Brief History of Time we just referred to by Hawking. And indeed, we just went through all this before, saying that indeed, he was saying that indeed, if it looks like there is something special, at first sight, the seven-day universe looks the same, wherever direction we look seems as if there's something special. Then he goes on to say, we must be at the center of the universe, emphasizing the fact that indeed, that's it. Then again, as we just read a few minutes ago, that Hawking is saying, no, 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 we shouldn't believe that because that would not be a modest thing for us to believe. Experimentally, we want to go to the experiment to show it isn't true. Experiment, if you take a satellite clock, GPS satellite clock, and put it in orbit, it's going to run faster than the Brace satellite clock. That's the experimental fact. We don't have to go into all the details today. You have an atomic clock counting here on the surface of the Earth. If you send it into orbit, it's going to count faster by a certain amount. So therefore, if you want to synchronize a GPS system, global positioning system, timekeeping mechanism, you've got to actually set the base atomic clock back 38,000 nanoseconds a day in order for it to synchronize with the base clock when you put it in orbit. That's not all. The space-time expansion theory requires the following. It requires that indeed wavelengths change in flight. That may not have been obvious a few minutes ago, except you saw the boxes changing. Those wavelengths were changing or increasing in flight. Anyway, the bottom line is the following. That indeed an experiment has been done. The cosmologists proposed the space-time expansion cosmological redshift, and they never validated the central assumption. David and I began to look into this and find out, wasn't there some way where that central assumption could be validated? And the answer is yes. We found the reference to be by Carol Alley several years ago. 1980, in fact, is when it was found. Big Bang implications of the GPS set up by Carol Alley. Now listen carefully. This is now Carol Alley telling the world what's wrong with the expansion wave shift explanation. Common mistake in dealing with relativistic time was made by one of the Air Force contractors in relation to the GPS. This is the notion that electromagnetic radiation changes frequency, or a photon changes energy as it propagates through a gravitational potential difference. What is a gravitational potential difference? Well, if I have something on the floor and I raise it to the desk here, there's a potential due to the actual mass of the Earth, a gravitational potential difference. That's all that is. If the physical clock, meaning the atomic clock, adjustments have been made so that all clocks are keeping what is called a common coordinate time, there's no effect on the frequency of radiation as measured in that coordinate time. However, the contractor had included in the computer programs to operate the system just such a correction, effectively correcting twice. We're going to explain this. For the relativistic effects. Actual experience with test GPS in orbit was required to persuade some engineers and physicists of their era. We should not be surprised at such lack of understanding of the fundamental concepts of general relativity, since the subject is almost never taught to engineers and rarely even to physicists. Now, listen to this. Also, this is now Carol Alley in this book, Quantum Optics and so forth, 1981. Carol Alley says this. Confusion about these concepts, about this time expansion concept, is not restricted to engineers and others who must deal with ultra-stable clocks, but is widespread among eminent physicists. In other words, it was in the setup, the experimental setup of the global positioning system, that it was discovered that indeed there is no There's absolutely no evidence whatsoever, disproof of the whole idea of light wavelengths expanding with respect to general relativistic effects. Halley's finding shows unambiguously that general relativity effects do not produce any in-flight change in the photon frequency or wavelength. That is the death knell of Big Bang cosmology, where it conclusively confirms Einstein's description. An atom absorbs or emits light of a frequency which is dependent upon the potential and the gravitational field in which it is situated, and not Freeman-Lemaitre expanding spacetime relativity, which requires relativistic effects cause in-flight wavelength expansion. These results disprove Big Bang's foundational expansion hypothesis, hence falsifying every facet of Big Bang cosmology, because it is these assumptions that determine whether a theory is true or false. A correct theory can only exist with correct assumptions. David and I bring this out, and since he's not with me anymore, working-wise, this is why I've had such great difficulty getting this out to the world. These findings show unambiguously that general relativity effects do not produce Big Bang's in-flight stretching of wavelength. This result of the death knell, I just read it, conclusively confirms Einstein's description. Einstein had it right, that indeed it's where the particle itself was emitted. The gravitational field there is what determines the redshift. So what we have is the following. Over the last 100 and so, 50, 80 years now, Big Bang cosmologists have been telling you that they've had the truth. The fact of the matter is, Big Bang cosmology has been just like Ptolemaic astronomy was decades ago. And that theory, the Earth was the center, supposedly, of the solar system, was stable, and all the planets and also the sun were moved around the Earth. Then it was found, Copernicus found that indeed the sun was the center, and all the planets and everything were moving around the sun. The same thing has happened with respect to Big Bang. They made faulty assumptions, and even when these faulty assumptions have been brought to their attention over and over again the last 20 years, they want to close the door on letting me get the information out to the scientific community. So what we have is Big Bang crashes, big time. Judgment Day for evolution. It's all over. See that one again. It's all over. New cosmic model of the universe, you'll have to go and read the papers. I'm out of town just about. I could go on and say back in 97, there was new information about supposing exploding stars in the universe, exploding and on and on and on. Turns out the 1997 paper I published about the new model of the universe explained all of that. They won't even let me publish that. I've brought that to the condition of astrophysicists. They won't say anything about it. One last thing. I believe this information needs to go to the world to a much larger extent than it's gone thus far. There is an individual, a group of individuals has contacted a producer to the effect that perhaps he might be interested in doing a film, a first-rate film, that would bring all this to the attention of the world in a first-class manner. That person, I believe, may be in the audience today, and I plan to see him later on. Initial contacts may or may not pan out. Whatever the situation may be, investigation is being made as to actually get this material out to the world in a way that the average man on the street is going to be able to understand they've been flummoxed, they've been deceived. And it's more than just an ordinary Watergate. This is a Watergate of all Watergates when it finally comes out. And the people such as yourself, the man on the street, finds out that his children have been sent to school to learn basically a lie. There's going to be a tremendous uproar somewhere along the line. I don't think it's far removed from coming out.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for all your meticulous work. I think it's coming to fruition now in the world. And personally, thank you for all your hard work. I taught in a public high school, and our science teachers, sometimes we'd have prayer meetings before school, and they could not teach anything about creation. And now I believe it's in Tennessee. I may have
That's
the
correct.
state, Tennessee,
That's correct.
where they have
A law.
a law now, and the teachers are allowed to
That's right.
go into what theories of evolution may not
That's right.
And so your work now is needed more than ever. And knowing the high school students, you need to make it simple. And maybe even YouTube or some kind of pamphlet or something like that, and make it available for high school teachers, because you would not believe how many science high school teachers are wanting to dive into these things and are absolutely prevented, and especially in California, by the public school system.
Thank you for bringing that up. I'm from Tennessee, from Knoxville, and that's been on the headlines of the Knoxville News Sentinel. I published a letter in the Knoxville News Sentinel in which I basically said that I had basically found this evidence that overturned the Big Bang, and that indeed I suggested that there were many churches there in the Knoxville area who presumably believed in the Genesis record of creation. And if they would open the door for me to speak at the downtown several thousand seat Coliseum, I would be happy to do that. And they could invite these prominent evolutionists who up to now will not set foot in any auditorium where I speak. Invite them to come, and we'll settle the issue right there in the state of Tennessee. I'm looking forward to the ACL, if the ACLU decides to initiate a case, praise the Lord. It will come to the attention of the world like nothing else. Lord of heaven and earth has a way of bringing it out. Thank you, but I've already gotten, hopefully, if there are any of the churches, there's a major Seventh-day Adventist church in the city of Knoxville. I'm sure the pastor has read my letter to the editor. If he will take some action and get the other churches behind me speaking at the Coliseum, all this could come to attention, at least of the state, maybe the nation, very, very soon. The God of heaven has a way of doing it. Especially, see, I made it very clear in this letter that indeed it's the evolutionists who are afraid of facing this evidence. And if they'll let me speak, then they can invite these evolutionists. See, as I mentioned to this letter to the National Press Club, for years, goes back to 1987, for years, I've been asking the evolutionists to come and, if at all possible, refute the evidence for creation that I presented in these publicized, in the publications, peer-reviewed publications. They've never come. And this latest issue of me trying to get them to come to the Coliseum there, we'll have to wait and see whether there's any church there in the Knoxville area, Genesis-believing church, that will open that door. If so, we'll go for it. Well, I'm hoping it's going to be a big auditorium. I'm going to put it this way. As I said a few minutes ago, this is information that God of heaven placed in the rocks in the universe to bring to the attention of the world the fourth commandment. And that indeed God, the creator of all, is behind this issue of the scientific evidence I've been publishing. It's incredible to believe that I could publish all these papers of my own free will without the evidence itself being there and being examined by these world-renowned scientists over and over and over again. It's unbelievable this could happen without the God of heaven actually placing the evidence there and over again me offering them to the opportunity to come and respond. Look at it this way. 35 years I've been publishing. 35 years these papers have been in the scientific literature. 35 years I've been challenging them with the evidence for creation. 35 years it's been met with silence. Years now, 25 years since Larry Taylor was there at the University of Tennessee claiming he could manufacture granite in the laboratory. 25 years have gone by. Absolutely nothing. In other words, when you test the actual foundational assumptions of the Big Bang, geologic evolution, and everything connected with it, it all fails. It's wrong. The whole theory is wrong. Evolution is wrong. And the great light of God's truth about creation, in my opinion, is soon to come to public attention.
I think we have time for one more question or comment, and then we better close.
Okay. Yes. All these scientists and these universities and such. Do you think they're basically is the pressure more from support within the university, that they're basically they're afraid that they'll lose their job or this kind of thing, position or whatnot?
Thank you for asking the question. The one word is conformity. Conformity. The scientific community is based on conformity. As the Dr. Howie said to me, to become a PhD physicist, you need to be mentored. I told him I wanted to find the truth for myself. All the people that have gone through the mentoring process of getting a PhD believe very, very firmly, you see, they've got the truth. So when we come along and present this evidence, whoa, this means if they accept that evidence, their house is going to fall, their reputations are going to fall. Everything they've worked for with decades of their lives is going to be shown to be an absolute farce.
So
And that indeed, the cover-up, the best part of all this that's going to be coming out is the huge absolute cover-up that the evolutionists have been practicing on people in America and around the world. When people find out how badly they have been deceived and deluded by the evolutionists, I believe this is going to be an explosion in itself. Go ahead.
this is like basically it's going to shake them to their foundations, and
It's going to shake the
basically
foundations
they're
of
very
the
afraid of
scientific
it.
community and all the evolutionists that have been deceiving people and believing that there is no God and everything connected with it. I tell you what, the Lord has permitted the situation to come to a climax, in my opinion. And all these things of hiding from the truth, hiding the failures of evolution from the science, from the normal, absolute people, you know, the rank and file people here in America who want to know the truth, they're going to wake up one morning to find they've been greatly deluded. And I believe there's going to be a tremendous reaction. So I'm not looking at what they have done in the past as much as the potential and the opportunities which I believe the Lord is going to provide here. In the days ahead, it's going to be a different scenario. And as I mentioned, I believe there may be in the audience today a film producer who has been talked to about the possibility of doing a film that would bring all this out to the world. Whether that's going to develop or not, I don't know. But I'll be talking with this gentleman sometime later this weekend.
Well, at least the youth in the universities, as you said, have been challenging these the unchallengeable, basically, and that's maybe a good sign too.
That is a good sign. We also remember this. The reason why most of you, a lot of you, perhaps have never heard of all this before is because the scientific community, number one, is keeping silent. They cannot respond and refute the evidence for creation that I'm presenting to you this afternoon. The only defense they have is to remain silent. If they say anything, the work is going to descend that indeed the news media and everyone is going to say, wait a minute, why haven't you told us a long, long time ago? Not only that, may I suggest also, there are not just evolutionists who are keeping quiet. There are others. There are others who have known of this work for a long time who have also decided to keep quiet.
My husband and I have been associated or followers or believers in Dr. Gentry's work for 50 or 60 years. And I know that at one time he told me all the papers that he'd submitted and all, nobody has ever doubted his work. He's always had, they have not responded that any of his work was faulty. The other thing that a few years ago, we went to a big auditorium in Fallbrook or that area, and it was a high school gymnasium, and it was Christian people, not Adventists, but they were creationists, and there were 10 speakers. One of them was a scientist that invented the MRI, and each one, as they gave their speech, quoted Dr. Gentry. It was very heartwarming for us.
Let me say, I deserve no credit for anything I've ever found. Anything that has ever come from my pen and papers, all due to the action, working of the Holy Spirit.
Well, thank you very much for coming, and
It's been my privilege to be with you.
we hope maybe sometime again to have you, and maybe we can discuss some of those other comments more. Maybe by that time you'll have some more papers in the literature to discuss.
Okay. Thanks so much for inviting me.